All right. We'll call to order the Planning Commission regular meeting, December 21st, 2023, 7 p.m. I'll ask the clerk to do roll call, please.
Anderson,
Here.
Patrick,
Here.
Broker is gone. Gone,
Here.
Lachey,
Here.
Mans.
Here.
And Clark.
Here. Well, before we move to the agenda, let me officially welcome our newest Planning Commission member, Joe Clark, to our team. So thank you for being here. He got approved yesterday by City Council. And then, of course, I also want to acknowledge the change in the role with Holly Anderson now being our council rep, but we're excited to have you continue and remain as part of our group. All right, I think everyone had an opportunity to see the agenda that was included in the pack. Is there any modifications? If not, then can we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Yep.
Second.
Moved by Lachey, second by Verdrick. This will be just a vote, a voice vote. All those in favor?
Yeah.
Yes.
Aye. Opposed? Agenda's approved. In your kit, you also had the minutes from our November 16th, 2023 meeting. Everyone have an opportunity to read through those. Any comments on the minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I did talk with the deputy clerk just before the meeting this evening. She had me as present last month online. I was out of the country and didn't make last month's meeting, but so
I
she's going to
missed
make
that.
that correction if you're okay with that.
Yes, please.
A tiny spelling correction on page 5. The fifth bullet, Holly Engel, Engel is with an E, not an I. I know, I know her and she's a Holly, so gotta look after my Hollies.
Any other modifications? If none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved as amended.
Who does amend a second?
Second.
Second by Anderson. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? None. Moves us to item 4, public comments. At this time, we will take public comments on any agenda item that we have on today's meeting docket. If you would like to speak in the room, just come up to the microphone, give us your name, your address, and tell us what agenda item you would like to be speaking in regards to. And online, if you just raise your hand, we'll try to acknowledge you after we finish in the room. And keep your comments to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. My name is Gary Kemp. I live at 1022 Holland Street. I know a number of you. I've been here a number of times on this short-term rental. So this is really about short-term rentals.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's better to have that come back when you get to the short-term rental section or say it now, because I'm afraid it's going to be lost and forgotten by the time you get there.
Yeah, this is our only public comment time
Yeah.
period.
So you want me to go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. I hope you can remember it. I have a question, first of all, is the short-term rental now it seems to be that we've convinced we're going to go with this police powers ordinances. I'm wondering, based on your meeting with the commission, if that is a given now, that they said we are going to go that way, or is it as it's in the minutes where it says you're authorized to make recommendations along those lines, but the decision as to whether or not it will be a zoning ordinance or a police powers ordinance has not been made yet. Can you clarify that?
Normally during public comment, we do not, but we will clarify. Said normally during public comment, we don't clarify or respond. But we will talk about that when we get to the short-term rental of how we're going to be proceeding with the commission's recommendation to council for police order.
Okay, well, you can save it till then. I have a great fear of what I'm hearing, and I know part of it may be terminology with police power. Sounds like police state, sounds like everything that's wrong with our country right now. and the direction it's moving. And that's one concern I guess I have. And it relates to a secondary concern, which is really a more important one, which has to do with not grandfathering anything based on zoning ordinances. And I think that would be a major mistake of the council and of you all if we are going to move that way. I know it may sound better for you, but I have real fears of when you start eliminating what's been done for 15 years or so, and various people putting a lot of money into what they've done and a lot of investment into what they've done, and suddenly you want to wipe that clear and move in what seems to be a much more authoritarian situation, especially since this whole project started out primarily because we had noise disruptions, garbage disruptions, parking disruptions, and we were concerned about the number of these. Now we're much more concerned about all the requirements and the laws and the safety things and the other things as adverse to what was already been printed, which was pretty specific and pretty good if you follow that, I thought, for these years, and it had been getting better all along. So I'm just concerned that this doesn't turn into an overboard thing which hurts our community and hurts the people who made all kinds of investments in these properties and which serve the whole purpose of bringing tourists to our town.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you. Anyone else in the room that would like to speak? Seeing none, is there anyone online? I do not see any hands. So seeing none, we will close out the public comment portion of tonight's agenda, which takes us to old business. And in the old business, we had the discussion last month about the creation of the downtown waterfront preservation zone and the changes that would entail to properties that were previously zoned into the Water Street North as well as Water Street South. Ryan, would you like to do an overview or have David join and kind of take us through the documents that he's prepared?
Sure, Mr. Chair. And as you know, you have all been hard at work for the last several months on the waterfront area regulations assessment project. And all of that work culminated in a public hearing last month where you took public comments on the proposed changes. Following that public hearing, you started deliberating or had further deliberations on the proposed changes and tabled these changes to your meeting this month. And my understanding from is that during that public hearing, you had essentially indicated that you wanted kind of some clearer documents showing kind of some side-by-side comparison of the changes, both for your sake as well as the community's sake. So Mr. Jurasik has kind of taken the project and kind of, boiled it down as much as he can, considering all the work that's been done for several months, to indicate the different public engagement you have done, the different assessments that you've done for several months, the different discussions that you've had, and then provide some documents to show kind of on a side-by-side basis, what the changes break down to from a dimensional perspective, from a use perspective. And then based on the conversation that you had last month about whether or not maybe there should be some uses that should be permitted versus becoming special land uses. There's some suggestions in your packet related to that. And then the other big change really before you, as far as the language change, is that there's a few properties along Culver Street that originally you were looking at a rezoning for. It's kind of a one block section there. Those have been taken out and essentially would remain Water Street South for the time being. So you can have some further discussion and analysis on another zoning district perhaps that they're appropriate for. So really these parcels are really just focused on just parcels that actually have frontage on the waterfront themselves. So for there, perhaps we have Mr. Jurasik on for kind of a short window tonight. So if you're all right with it, maybe I'll turn it over to him for any additional comments he might have, and then really just turn it over to you for your questions and dive right on in.
Sure. That'd be great. And David, when you get ready to speak, if you could remind us of one of the considerations that's in here of making some businesses or some uses permitted if there's no changes versus special land use if they are making changes. I know that's come up by several commissioners here during the week. So as you're walking us through, if you can just kind of highlight the rationale behind that.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me okay tonight?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, good. Yes, so in the report, we wanted to create kind of an executive summary that addressed all of the changes and the justification. So the report itself is really kind of an expansion from the public hearing presentation from last month. And then on page 5 and 6 of the report, which it may be numbered differently in the packet, but page 5 and 6 of the report include a comparison table between the existing C1 Water Street North and the proposed C2 downtown waterfront development north of Francis, and then existing C2 Water Street South and the proposed C2 downtown waterfront preservation south of Francis. So in the first table, we included all the dimensional standards and included in the light red where the standards did become a bit stricter in terms of greater setbacks, building stories, in other dimensional requirements of that nature. The next table, which is also important to note, is the same general setup between the comparisons north and south. We've included the table that shows whether or not there are any changes to land use regulation between the existing and proposed zoning district. Where it's noted in white, there's no change. Where it's noted in green, it's actually less restrictive, or something's been permitted or reclassified from permitted or to permitted or special. In yellow, it's really there's been an existing permitted use where it's now special. So as we mentioned last time, when it's reclassified to a special land use, there's a bit more discretionary review authority with that classification. And then the light red, where it indicates that a use was permitted but now is not permitted. So I hope that helps to make a better comparison between what we have on the books now versus what we're proposing north and south of Francis. And then following the table, based on some of the public comment from last month and some of our internal conversations as well, we have a couple considerations that we wanted to run by the commission tonight. First off, to remove first floor apartments not facing Water Street, Culver Street, and Griffith Street to first floor apartments not facing Water Street. And so that would need to be done based on the removal of that certain block, the Culver and Griffith block from the rezoning proposal for this time. But more importantly is going to be number 2 and 3. We wanted to include change of use as a permitted use rather than special for short-term rentals, home occupations, and then we have 5 different land uses that we would like to suggest that being permitted uses if it's just a simple change of use. And so how we really kind of make that threshold, we say change of any of the following uses when the following is not proposed or required: new buildings or structures, expansion to buildings and structures, or new and expanded site development. And that's such as parking, grading, outdoor storage. So our thought was that if we have changes to uses, so you have an existing building and someone was to change it to an art gallery or to professional business offices or upper floor apartments or personal service or retail, that if there was no other building expansion, that it could simply be a permitted use without having to request a special land use to the Planning Commission. And the language that we use here in this paragraph C concerning the new building structures and site development, that is actually the same language that's in the moratorium. So we thought that was a good way to describe what type of development that would be more concerning or might trigger the special land use review. And then we move on to the uses for special. So when you have those same 5 uses, when you are proposing expansion or site development, that would then trigger special land use review to the Planning Commission. So we thought that this was a way that to take a little bit of the burden off of a an applicant or landowner if they were simply changing the use of existing space. And we felt like we agreed that it might be a bit much to require the special land use process for change of use without new buildings or site development. Other than that, I'm happy to answer questions concerning the comparison tables or those suggestions for the proposed ordinance before you might make a recommendation tonight or next meeting.
Sure. Thank you, David. A job well done also on preparing this document. I think it really helps all of us here on the commission, but anyone who is in the community who had concerns couldn't really understand what the proposed changes were or the intent behind it and all the things that we did. So I want to compliment you on the document. One of the questions that I did have, and it did come up with some people I was talking to in the last couple of weeks, was if one of the 5 businesses, the art gallery, business, professional, upper floors, personal service, retail, if they were wanting to do modification to a property, wouldn't that generate a site plan review that would come before the planning commission anyway? And whether that's to David or to Ryan.
One more time, I just want to make sure I understand your
Curious.
question fully, so.
With any of the ones that we're saying we should consider to make permitted uses unless they're making modifications to the property. And it came up and they said, well, if they were making modifications to the property, wouldn't they have to do a site plan review for those modifications, which would bring it in front of the planning commission, regardless of whether it's a special land use requirement? No?
No, so, in short, if it's a permitted use, that's something that, certainly there's still, things that we would look at from a site plan type perspective, at an administrative level. At least with, your zoning ordinance and what you require. With a special land use is where you have the site plan requirement that's going to, come into play.
So I guess, I was confused because I remember a few of the times when somebody was just like adding, like over at the old Lucy's property, when they were adding like a new cooler or moving it, it came before us as like part of a site plan review. So that was through because it was originally a special land use.
Correct, exactly.
That's the part I forgot then.
I'm not sure I understood that. The second half of what David went through, when something changes, when does it now require this, becomes a special use as opposed to a permitted use?
So there'll be two layers here, with just these specific uses or others. I mean, you could change this list and shorten it or add to it. But the short of it is, if you're not expanding the building or doing any site improvements, adding any additions on, and you want to do any of these uses, it would simply be permitted and,
Yep.
But if you're going to do an addition or site improvements, then you're going to be considered a special land use and trigger both the special land use and site plan review.
And the intent of that, I'm trying to understand why why would it not still just be a permitted use?
Right. Well, I think it's kind of looking at, structures and buildings expanding or becoming more than what they are now seems to be the concern with waterfront development pattern.
We have the setbacks, the other chart that gives us all of our dimensional requirements that have to be met. But as far as the use, I'm not sure the intent or the purpose. And on a separate note, I'd like to ensure that we put charter fishing. It's harder that's where they have to be is on the waterfront with their charter fishing. So as one of the permitted uses, I'd like to see if we could include that. But that's sort of.
Yeah,
a separate argument. But so I don't understand why, because they modify their building, they would then have to go to a special land use if it's one of the ones that we said was permitted previously.
Right.
That's the intent.
Dave, you want to add on to?
Sure. Yeah. The intent is, so when we're adding on, really from the beginning of this project, we wanted to be able to increase the authority that we would have over ensuring that there's quality and sensitive development along the waterfront. And then when we classify use as a special land use, we do have the discretionary review authority and those standards, which are already in the zoning ordinance. And then in section 6 of the proposed ordinance, we have design and aesthetics standards and waterfront protection standards. So those would only apply to special land uses within the waterfront preservation district and C4 resorts. But those are only going to kick in if we classify them as special land uses. So we figured anytime that something is expanding, they're adding square footage, they're adding stories, they're expanding a site. If we have it as a special land use, we can apply these standards to ensure that the development is considering these priorities of the city, and that's they're meeting the zoning requirements, but they're meeting them in a way that might take into consideration city priorities for views in other sensitive type of development practices.
Okay, I understand. I don't know, I don't agree, but I understand.
Yeah, and from the beginning, we wanted to include that greater authority, and so adding the list of just change a use as permitted, that does loosen it up a bit and makes it that's more accommodating to the change of use. That's less of a burden to have to go through a special land use process for change of use. I should note there are some current special land uses, for instance, restaurants and hotels that are currently special land uses that would remain special land uses. So, and even if it was a change of use, so there are some cases that we're saying, a restaurant or a hotel, even if it's just a change of use with no expansion, it's still a use that could have impact on other properties for other non-development reasons, more like operational reasons. So those ones are remaining special land use, even if it's just change of use with no expansion.
Understood. That's the way it's been previously. Understand that. I don't see the additional hoops to jump through is the part I have.
Sure.
If they're permitted, why are they not permitted?
It would maybe, so to provide some context, I mean, in any zoning district, if you change from a special land use to something else that's a special land use, that triggers special land use review. And so what Dave is adding here, or the changes that he's proposing, is actually lessening that in narrow circumstances where some changes to something else that would otherwise be, require special land use. If there's not basically a change to the exterior of the building, then it's not subject to special land use review.
Understood.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, say one of the buildings north of Francis that takes up the whole lot, if they fire or something, wanted to completely replace that, the same owner wanted to completely replace that facility, and they weren't, so they would obviously have to meet the new setback requirements, but would they have to get, like, say, a charter fishing business, which is going from permitted to special? Would they have to do that, or because they weren't really changing their business, would they only have to do the setbacks?
I think that's more of a non-conforming use question than one that would be governed by the special land use requirements here. And I think the ordinance provides that if your structure is destroyed.
Or if they decide, or they wanted to just do a new structure.
Right. So, we do have standards for non-conforming structures if they're destroyed by fire, an act of God, windstorm, something along those lines. And essentially it can be rebuilt within its original dimensions, even if they're not conforming. The key there is it just can't be like an intentional act that brought it down. So if you choose to tear your building down, you lose your non-conforming rights. But if it's
Okay.
outside of your control, then
So I decided to build a new building because, I won the lotto and wanted to build a new building. And I met the setbacks. Would I still, and it was the same kind of business that would be a special land use instead of just being permitted. Would my permittedness go with that new building, or would I have to go through?
So I think that would be, rather than a non-conforming structure, that's a question of a non-conforming use. And if your
Okay.
intent isn't to abandon the non-conforming use, then
Okay.
you're able to basically keep on doing that use, even if it is interrupted by something
Okay.
like the building being torn down. You'd still have that. You wouldn't have to go through the change, through the special land use process to continue doing what you started lawfully doing by right.
Okay.
If you changed your use to something else and then wanted to go back, then you'd have to go through the special
Okay.
land use
So
process.
current landowners in north of Francis, as long as they continue in that kind of business. And if they voluntarily rebuild, in that case, it would have to meet the new setbacks.
Mhm.
But they would not be disadvantaged by these changes other than if they stayed in the same business.
Yeah, none of them are going to be retroactive.
It won't be retroactive, but if they're doing a new building, that would be considered a structural change, which would be a special land use, so they would have to come before the planning commission.
Okay.
Art gallery that changes the building, then has to come for a special land use to be an art gallery again after that change.
If they're making
Based on
modifications.
the way it's written today.
Correct.
That's
If
what
we
I-
take this into, because currently the way it's written, everything is special.
Any
So-
modification or just?
Well, if it's a,
structure?
if it's an art gallery to begin with and it's an art gallery afterwards, there's not.
I choose to change the building, and make structural changes, that's.
So I think because it's subject to site plan review, you might need to amend the site plan, but if the use isn't changing, that wouldn't implicate the special land use review.
Okay, then I'm a different understanding of what.
Right.
And I think the standards in subsection 3, what they are designed to do is, so there's a carve out for changes from one special land use to another special land use that don't involve an exterior change. That's permitted by right. So instead of going through the special land use process again, you can do it without the planning commission's approval. But if there are exterior changes, then that triggers both site plan and special land use review. But there has to be a change in use and a change in the building.
Yeah,
I now.
Okay.
and part of that might have been, I didn't maybe more fully explain the question that was asked earlier. So there are situations where may have a use that's permitted, say a commercial use, it's a non-residential use. A lot of them are going to fall under a requirement to have a formal site plan review.
Okay. So when we're considering these permitted uses or the special land use for these currently 5 classifications, that kicks in if it's a change of use. But if it was an art gallery that is just making modifications and it's staying an art gallery, it does not trigger the special land use. And it would, if it was permitted, it remains permitted by administrative sign off.
Yeah, it might be, so I think that might be something to be subject to formal site plan review. They'd have to get an amendment to their site plan to expand the physical building on the property,
Right.
depending on if it's a major or minor amendment.
Okay.
So I'm totally confused. I'm totally confused now. So if it's an art gallery
Mhm.
and they decide they want to use it now as a professional office or a business office. So they want to go from art gallery to business office, or a retail store or a personal service establishment. But nothing else changes except that.
Yes,
So they're not subject to going through the special land use process, right?
that's correct.
If we make
If you
this,
make those
if we make this change, the
Yeah.
way it's currently written, they would be.
No,
subject.
I know that.
Okay.
Let's just stick with this for a minute.
Clarify
Yeah.
my comments. there.
Right.
Yep.
But just to add on to your example, if you want to go from an art gallery to a retail store and add and do an expansion on
Where
that,
I was
not,
going. So if
then
they
you are going
change,
to, be
Then you're going.
correct,
That's the difference between 2 and 3.
right?
Okay, on that point, I can see how that would trigger a site plan review. Art gallery to an office and they add on, I can see how that would trigger a site plan review. But I don't see why that necessarily triggers a special land use review.
And I-
Simply because they're expanding the building. But there's still the use, if you're differentiating between a change in the building versus simply a change in the use, 2 uses stay the same, both special. I don't see why adding on would trigger both. I'm missing that part.
Yeah, I think that's where Dave's indicating that at that point, your special land use standards apply, both your general standards and your standards specific to the waterfront preservation district, which also have additional requirements for design and aesthetics that you can then take into account. Whereas if it was simply subject to a formal site plan review, it would be just looking at the dimensional requirements. and other things that's very specific to that site. Right now, as it's written, the special land use standards are what is adding, your design and aesthetic considerations.
And where does it say that there should be like an asterisk? If we're all scratching our heads, we've got regular citizens and contractors and architects and developers who are gonna be coming in here and trying to figure out what the heck we're talking about, and they're not gonna have our record to go to, or the city council record, and, it seems like we're drawing asterisks on asterisks, like, okay, well, if the special use doesn't change, oh, asterisk, unless the building's increased in size, and then, but and then there's an asterisk on top of that, like, that, okay, yeah, this is,
The package doesn't necessarily spell out those design criteria, those items, and we have the historic district to control some of that already in place.
So so just for some clarity, so the design and aesthetic special land use standards that are before you to
yes.
possibly add to the ordinance. So on page 20 of your packet, under special land use standards of approval, under C, 1, this is design and aesthetics. Development of the property shall demonstrate a thoughtful and concerted effort to maximize, to the maximum extent practical, to maintain view corridors and sightlines to the waterfront while conforming to the setback and dimensional requirements of the applicable zoning districts. It should include architectural diversity while ensuring a cohesive and visually appealing waterfront, and incorporate landscaping or art to enhance the aesthetic appeal. So when you review going forward, if these changes occur, anything that ends up being a special land use in these particular zoning districts, that's something that you will have to evaluate in making a decision, whether or not they've done that or not.
No, the problem I have is switching from an art gallery to an office doesn't trigger this. But if they put window boxes in the front, that will trigger it. And that doesn't seem logical to me. I mean,
I think we should have permitted uses that are permitted uses.
Even if the building wants to make a change.
Yeah, the site change plan has to occur with the building changes, but why would we want to weigh in on giving them special land use requests for something that we think is permitted?
So it makes sense to me that we have building changes. So if you change the building, that needs a site plan review. I do wonder if, especially for some of the businesses that are permitted uses now, if, I think I agree with CJ, given that fishing is so important to our economy, if we wouldn't consider having that continue to be a permitted use, and maybe look at some of these other ones, because what would be the downside of keeping the north of Francis permitted uses? I mean, other than I get the residential changes, but
The only one we missed was charter.
so yeah, why art galleries go from permitted to special?
That's how it's currently written. And what we had the public hearing on last month,
Right, but when you look on the chart on page 11,
right?
the bottom chart, north of Francis, art galleries today permitted, in the future special.
That was how it was drafted for the public hearing, and that's why,
Right.
that's why the consideration is, we're saying,
Okay,
let's
got it,
consider
got it.
making that a permitted
Okay,
use.
so just those, so the only one, so the ones that
So we-
are still changing are charter fishing and,
I think that's the only one we missed.
okay, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Perhaps I just misunderstood. The first column is what's existing in that district.
Correct. That's what it currently is.
Right.
And then in that second column was the proposed as the ordinance was drafted.
Right,
for our
exactly.
public
Okay.
hearing.
Yep, we're on the same page.
And then we have the considerations of making
Exactly.
these
Of making
other,
changes to those.
And
Okay.
those. Yep.
basically, if they're not making a change to the structure, we were saying that if it was previously a permitted use, it would be permitted.
Okay,
That's what number 2 does of consideration
for those categories.
for those categories.
Right,
So basically, anything that was previously permitted would continue to be permitted if there's no structural changes being made. 3 says if there's structural changes.
got
it
it.
would
Yeah,
still
I
become
get what
special.
this, yeah, okay.
And I think that the logic, and I know it's semantics, but having that design, and then if you look on page 20, it's the design and aesthetics, and then it's also that waterfront protection that gives that ability to say, are they protecting the shoreline? Are they ensuring that the structures be resilient to climate change? These are things that are not part of the current site plan review. So if we wanted to have that ability to look at those 2 parts in addition to a site plan, we would need to have it as a special land use.
Okay.
Yeah, and those make sense to me.
Now, what is the feeling of having the charter fishing added in as a permitted?
Yes.
I think I would support having it be a permitted use.
Yes.
This is something that, consider totally with respect to, whatever decision you make. I mean, I just think about, I think we envision maybe what a charter fisher area might be today, but I mean, say for example, and it's hypothetical, the lot that's out here, would you be okay with it being totally dedicated to a charter fishing operation and them doing structures dedicated to fish cleaning and there's odor things to consider? And I mean, so is that use in a larger sense than maybe what you might envision it right now? Is that something that you feel like from a use perspective that you would want to evaluate more than just a site plan per se? Just something to think about then.
It's something that I actually personally still like to have it as special because primarily if you look at Water Street South, it wasn't even permitted use. And, now that these are not separate districts, it would become a permitted use, kind of across. So we're changing it from a not permitted use to giving them the ability to make it a special use if they so wanted to. And I kind of agree because we don't know what, like right now it says charter fishing tours. Is it really, but what if they want to do charter fishing like right on the waterfront or those are, again, I'm not saying it couldn't be approved, but I don't see a reason why it wouldn't come before commission. So you could really understand what the business is.
Well, it's something
before-
maybe that might help the planning commission is that, I mean, it's a commercial land use, so it would be subject to site plan review anyways. So they'd be in front of the planning commission regardless.
But would you be able to look at it for the other 2 things, the design aesthetics and waterfront protection in the site plan review though?
No,
Not it's written right. And then there's other general special land use standards to consider. Is it, in line with the character? I mean, there's a lot of
Character,
factors that you have to consider. Whether a special land use in general should go in a particular location.
What this does, but also, again, specific to charter fishing tours, is it makes it consistent for the entire district. It doesn't break off at north and south of Francis. So you have some consistency for the future. And you don't have somebody come in here 20 years from now and go, what did that planning commission, city council do 20 years ago? Why did they differentiate between north and south of Francis? And the answer is because there's an existing charter north of Francis and there's not south. But is that the kind of planning that we want to do prospectively rather than try to be consistent for the entire waterfront, which is, I think, the overarching thing of our entire task here
Yeah,
is to
Right.
try to get some consistency and uniformity for
sense.
the entire waterfront.
That's a good point, Mark.
that's a really good point.
Why they pay me the big bucks.
So to that exact point, it's one of the special land use standards, number 9, is that in the nature so if you were to look at something, whether or not it's a special land use that you're willing to approve in a district, you're looking at is the nature, location, size, and layout of the use. Is it harmonious? Will it be a harmonious part of the district in which it's situated, taking into account, among other things, the prevailing shopping habits, convenience, access by patrons, the physical and economic relationship of one type of use to another, and characteristic groupings of uses of the district. So That's a lot to say, but I mean, you have that exact standard where you would evaluate exactly what Mark said, if if something is a special land use versus a permitted use.
Something that I didn't notice until just moments ago, page 12, parking facilities. Parking facilities are not defined anywhere in our ordinance. I assume, again, I can picture parking structures, parking lots.
Mhm.
But, I'm not sure that it necessarily doesn't also include parking spaces for adjacent buildings or, I mean, it bothers me a little bit, the parking facilities is not defined in anywhere else in our zoning ordinance, or should I not be worried about that?
I think it's a fair point. We've had not particularly on the waterfront, but a couple of questions in the city center district related to the parking facilities and, correct, that has been an issue, so.
A 2.5-story parking structure built right on the waterfront, parking garage, but, anyway, it's just,
As I read the ordinance, it's among I guess it was among the list of principal land uses. So I think the inference there, even without a definition, is that the primary use of the property would be for a parking facility.
Got
So
it.
it wouldn't refer to, like on-site parking for a business or something, because that's just kind of an accessory use that's a part of that building and be a property
what I was
that's
concerned about.
dedicated. just to
Okay, so it would
parking.
not include, parking facilities does not include on-site parking for a business
Correct.
or, again, like if you get on Water Street, the parking spaces in front of Ship and Shore.
Right.
For example, that would not be a parking facility,
Yeah, that's how I read the ordinance.
Off-street
okay,
parking
thanks.
area, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is Dave.
Hey, David.
Can I make one clarification about the change of land use, special land uses?
Yes.
There was comments before about when we change, let's just say the art gallery is or let's just say any special land use, there's a change to it. And we're saying if there's any change to the square footage or so on, and it's changing to a different use, it triggers special land use. But I wanted to clarify that if you have a special land use and there is any change to square footage or traffic pattern or any similar element, section 154.087 requires that special land use to go back to the planning commission. So there was a comment before made that said, if something, if it changes to one of these uses with an expansion, it's subject to special land use and site plan review. But I wanted to say that if there's any special land use that has any sort of square footage or other type of traffic pattern or similar element change, it would be subject to special land use review.
If it was a special land use before and you make that change, you got a special land use again. Yep, I understand.
You're
that.
expanding the use essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
It's helpful. Great chart, Dave.
Again, another separate question I had was regarding the parcels on Culver Street that we are accepting out of Water Street South. And we just have to leave them as Water Street South instead of the Preservation District. Can we not, as part of this, if so facto, make those part of the city center rezoning district? Can't we just, not if so facto, but I mean, can't we make that part of this, our recommendation, city council, that they may be moved over to?
Mark, I think what the intention is, and we'll probably, if we have time tonight, we'll talk about some of the things we're looking at for 2024. The intention for 2024 is for us to look at all the districts that are in the downtown area, Water Street East, Water Street North, Water Street South, City Center and City Center Transitional, and trying to determine, do we have the right intent and the right reasons for
Gotcha.
what's permitted and not
Okay.
permitted? And it will require a public hearing to have those rezoned.
Okay.
So we determined just to take them out, just like we did with Water Street North. on the east side of the street, to
Right.
take it out, let it remain as Water Street North, knowing that we need to come back and readdress. Does it fit in with our view of what the remaining parts of the downtown should be? So first, we're dealing with the waterfront. I think our next step has got to be to look at all the other districts and then try to determine, are our uses consistent with, if something's allowed in one zone and not allowed in another zone, is there a reason for it? Other than the fact that when it was written 10 years ago, that zone had that type of business, this one didn't. And so, that's,
Got it. I see. That makes sense.
Yep.
That's why it's being held in abeyance. Got it.
Well said, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I did have a question that came up, and I'd like to see what the rest of the commissioners thought. There were some proposed changes to the dimensional setbacks on Water Street South properties. Where we used to have as you can see, Water Street South, you had a side setback on each side was required at 10 feet. And now we're moving it to a 40-foot side setback, or 40-foot total. So they can do 20 and 20, 30, 10, 40, 0, whatever their rationale was. It was kind of pointed out that on some of the lots, because with the setbacks, if they had to build a building to be able to make it feasible, they may need more than a 45% lot coverage, which is what they currently have, which is a very small, when you consider that we've got much larger lot coverages in the other parts of downtown. So I was just curious whether or not we would want to see more of like a 50 or 55 or 60% lot coverage for the district for Water Street South. And what other people's feelings were on that.
So I'll talk about that. So yeah, I agree. The intent when I thought we went into this was not to necessarily punish the south side as much. We knew that the north, where we had the 100% coverage, we needed to talk about some side setbacks, but I didn't feel we were going to impact the south as much as the current writing does. To protect those sides, if we opened up that percentage, I would be comfortable with that, but I'm not sure why the old setbacks weren't adequate on the sides. But if that's something we really want, then I would want to open up the 45% building area.
Any thoughts from others?
Did we lose Dave? Looks like we did.
Are you asking for Dave's?
Yeah.
I was just
I
asking,
was gonna-
I was asking.
I
any
think
of
he was asking the
commissioners
commissioners. Yeah.
what they were, if there was thoughts on that type of change. Because I'm just looking like Water Street East, so I'm going to use that as an example. They have a 65% lot coverage. Water Street North, had the 100%.
What is
Uh,
the rationale for the 45%?
That's what it is today.
That's what it is today. So
So-
when we were doing it, I didn't catch it, and somebody else, I've had it brought up to me by 2 or 3 individuals, and even CJ was saying he's looking at it. That as we're looking to make these changes, do we want to bring it more in line with what's allowed in the other zones?
Unless there's a reason for not doing it. I mean, it just, I don't understand how we explain the difference to people.
No. And it's something that I think it gives them more flexibility to be able to try to meet these additional standards
Right.
of this, more setbacks in the front as well as on the sides.
And that's
it
a
just-
big difference.
It's a huge difference. And so and again, if we're going to recommend it, it became that question. Currently, like I said, Water Street East, I know is 65% coverage, but that is on the east side, of the street versus the waterfront.
Right.
So, I don't know if we want to go recommending 65 or if you wanted to split the difference and make it 55. It's kind of hard to come up with what is the number that you want to use, but again, I can only assume the 45 was because when they did the measurements back in 2014 to write it, 45 was the largest coverage in that area, and so they made it 45%. But it doesn't fit in with the other, zones, which is the issue that I have.
And I'll agree that making the sides a little bigger does preserve some sight lines,
Mhm.
but we're being restrictive on the percentage, now the sight lines, so let's protect the sight lines and open it up to, and I'm a 65 number, just to pick a number.
What? Again, you know, 65, keep it consistent for now.
Is everybody,
So what would, Ryan, any downsides we aren't thinking about for that?
No. Well, I mean, just at the basic level, more of the lot can be covered you know, I think there's, one of the options that, you know, these changes is also, you know, you're proposing to loosen the plan unit development standards as well. And so if somebody has an issue with the larger setbacks and making a project work with the maximum lot coverage, one of the options they would have would be to pursue a plan unit development project where they could get some relief from the maximum lot coverage concern that they have if they were, you know, giving, you know, some other things that the city, you know, felt were, or you felt were desirable essentially. So, and so there is kind of a mechanism there to, have some give and take if there's a project that, that becomes an issue for a particular, developer.
Keeping in
Do you
mind
want-
what we want to achieve here, which is, I see three main things that I think we've been talking about, and when I talk to residents, to try to achieve, one, of course, is a restriction on height, which I think we've addressed and nobody's talking about. The other is to eventually have a boardwalk all the way down to Willow Park. And the third, I think, is this idea of side yard setback, so that there's, if we could do, as we were talking about, moving, say, a PUD where a building has 0 on one side but has 40 on the other, so that there's more a visual as people walk down Water Street, or you look down one of the streets and sees towards the water, there's more a visual availability of directly to the water. And I think that's a goal that if we increase the side yard setback requirements, then we necessarily need to allow a larger lot coverage to just make it amenable.
Just to give you another example just to consider. So the Butler patio, for example, I'm not sure what that project ended up at as far as, lot coverage, for example, what additional land they may or may not have had, but obviously there's some setbacks to consider, but if you increase your lot coverage, maybe the structure ends up expanding, more so if they could fit it right, and cover more area than maybe it was allowed to cover before, so.
Yes.
Yep, I just wanted, just
everything else.
just thinking through different examples.
And also on the.
What is your goal ultimately,
Right.
so.
And when we talk about, I just threw out like what Water Street East was, but if we look at the resort district, they have a lot coverage of 50%. So on that side of the water, it's set at 50. So again, it's, we don't have to jump all the way to the 65. You could have 50 so that all waterfront has the same. It's not a big change between 45 and 50, but it's still, at least there's rationale as to why, what that number, where it came
But our
from.
number to the north will still be much greater than.
Correct.
It's true too, yeah. Well,
is-
residential property owners and like community residential, you're limited to 30%,
Right,
so,
Right.
so.
And the commercial district is 100%, so.
Yeah, yeah. So it's thinking about, building mass, impervious surface that you're talking about right next to your river and, but then again, like I said, fair point. You have your northern part of that district that right now you can cover 100% of it, just in the southern part of it.
And
So-
you're still, and you are requiring that 40 feet, that has to, at a minimum. I mean, we'd like to have more, of course. But it has a minimum of 40. And I just was trying to get a sense as to, before we make a recommendation, that at least this was addressed as to whether we want to recommend a change from the 45 to a 50 or 65.
Well, I think the consensus is that we do want to make a change. I mean, that's what I'm hearing.
That the, now on something like this, if we're recommending it, can we do it just based upon a consensus, or do you think we actually have to
Yeah, I mean,
vote to
yeah,
add something in as a consideration.
yeah, it's like, for example, tonight, if you're gonna make a recommendation, you make a recommendation with, whatever changes to what's before you tonight that you're recommending, yeah. So
And
you-
is
you can list them.
everyone, you're in favor of a change to 65 or
I-
50?
I think that's the question mark
Okay.
right now in terms of how much.
Are you in favor of a change?
Yes.
Mark, are you in favor of a change?
Yes.
Ollie,
I am.
I'll support a change.
then where would we like to fall between 50 and 65?
I mean, it seems to me that I'm the new kid on the block, so give me some breathing room here, but I mean, I think Brian had a pretty good point. I mean, there is a remedy for somebody who wants to, exceed the percentage, on the lot, which is to follow the exception process that's been put in place. So I would be leaning more towards the 50%.
Same.
And because it keeps it with the other waterfront.
Exactly.
Are you good with 50? Mark, you good with 50?
No pressure.
It's not a big change.
Well, no, we're kind of pulling numbers out of somewhere and, the nature of the other side of the water, the nature of the buildings and everything is very different. I'm not gonna stand in the way of 50%, but my only thought was, gosh, to go from 45% to 50% on a lot this size is like, so.
In my mind, I think it's about the same as the extra 10 feet we took away from the sides. That's why I'm okay with the 50. If we adding that little bit bigger, but we made them keep the side setbacks. We went from 20 to 40.
Okay,
That's how I got my brain.
if you worked out the numbers and that,
Well, yeah.
okay, great.
Right. Thank
Great.
you, CJ.
I'm on board. That's cool.
Okay. So in our motion, we would have a
Well, it's
fourth
sentiments.
consideration of the downtown waterfront preservation district south, moving from 45% to 50%. What is the feeling on allowing the permitted uses in 2 and still having the special uses as it's in here as considered for consideration versus keeping everything special as it was in our original draft that we had the public hearing on last month?
I feel more comfortable with what's on page 13.
I would agree.
I would just like to move to add charter fishing to that list in for item 2.
I mean, as number 6.
And the 6th one in the item, well, I'm only want to talk about item 2 on that page.
The fact that it wasn't permitted in Water Street South, that's a huge change.
Right.
It wasn't a special land consideration. It wasn't permitted.
We've lost one charter fisherman in South Haven. We continue to lose that business. The city council's talked about you're doing something for a fish cleaning station. I just don't. I feel it's something that we do want to not scare away.
But if it came through as a special land use, if somebody wanted to do it, they would still make a presentation and it could still be approved.
Sure. Yeah. But I just don't know why make them jump through that hoop? They have to do their site plan anyways.
Well, as I said, I don't see the difference. Other than what exists now, I don't see the difference between waterfront north of Francis and waterfront south of Francis in terms of what potential business might locate in either place.
Correct.
Taking away from the fact what exists there now. And so, again, I just for what it's worth, it seems more logical to me to keep it consistent with make it special for both or make it permitted for both, but I don't like the idea that we've got a fish cleaning operation right next to Wicks Park, so
Correct.
to go with our planning commissioners or planning director's thought there. So we're right out here. So I would be in favor of keeping it special for both north and south, for the entire district.
That's what
I would agree as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're in agreement. We'll keep it as special. So. Are there other items that we would like to discuss with this?
Item 3, the requirement to go to special land use after the. As clarified, are we still? The way item 3 is on page 13, that's remaining?
I'm good with that personally, because I like the fact that it triggers the special land use, which gives us that additional ability to kind of look at it from the design and waterfront protection aesthetic standpoint.
I agree as well.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
If there's no other, items that anyone wants to bring up for consideration, would we like to entertain a motion for recommending this to council with the 4 considerations?
Which
Yeah.
I'm with you. What,
So
I'm
the-
looking at.
The
3.
considerations on the 3 considerations on page 13
Hey,
plus, plus a change of,
4th consideration that we would have to add would be that the downtown waterfront preservation district south lot coverage increases from 45 to 50%.
Got it.
So that would be a 4th consideration that it's
Thank you.
For
The
the
recommend-
sake of keeping the record clear here, it does look like there is a 4th consideration that Dave included that just isn't numbered.
Oh,
you're right.
oh,
which we haven't discussed.
so then we'd have a 5th consideration. Okay. Oh, I see, yes. Let me take a quick look. I missed that one. So where's my resort? I don't know how I missed that. C4. Okay. Oh, I think, is that because the current resort district, short-term rental is a permitted land use.
Right.
And I believe when we drafted the ordinance that was at the public hearing last month, everything moved to special. And so since we were looking at each of the regions as to what would make sense to move back to permitted versus special, the only one that was permitted in the resort area previously was, essential services and short-term rental. So his question is for the planning commission to consider reclassifying it back as a permitted use versus special use. Which is similar to what we've done with the changes in number 2.
Right. And the only time we require a short-term rental coming to planning is an ADU, is that correct currently?
Correct.
Okay.
yeah.
So that would so moving it back to permitted would keep it consistent with the
Consistent
rest
with
of
all the
it.
other zones.
That I think that makes sense.
Correct. And
That
certainly as
seems
part of
fair.
your other updates, your short-term rental regulations, if you determine some changes are needed from on a district by district basis, you could still make that as part of that process.
Right.
That makes sense.
So our motion would be for the recommendation, subject to the 5 considerations.
Yes. Who's brave enough to word a motion?
Okay, that's what I'm wondering, would the motion then be that we are recommending to the city council to approve the zoning ordinance and zoning map as submitted, subject to? Would that? Would
I
that be,
think that's exactly.
would that be the
You're asking the
wordage?
city attorney, I think
Yeah.
that's a perfect.
is that the wordage that should be used?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good motion.
Could you repeat that, Stephen?
You making the motion?
I didn't know, I didn't think the chair
Yeah,
usually,
yeah.
the chair doesn't usually make the motion, so
Right.
it's.
Right, sure. I make a motion to adopt the recommendations with the 4 considerations provided. in the
5.
Packet plus the one where we would like the lot size to be raised from 45 to 50 in the current Water Street South. But it will be.
Or should it be the proposed?
Yeah.
Water Street?
Well, it'd be.
I guess, yeah, I guess it's the same
Development
thing.
district or-
So I think the motion is for us to recommend to city council
Adopt.
that they adopt the zoning ordinance and zoning maps as laid out at the public hearing.
This isn't
With-
a public
No,
hearing.
as was laid out at the public hearing last month with the changes for the 4 considerations plus what you had. Plus the 50, would that be
My
appropriate?
only concern with, which is referencing the public hearing is just because there was a small change since then, and that was taking out those parcels along Culver Street. So,
I think we should
Yeah.
just go with the language that's
Yeah.
there.
yeah,
It's on.
Page 14. So you're basically making a motion to recommend that the city council.
Recommend the city council approves the zoning ordinance and zoning map. With the 5 total amendments, 4 that are listed, plus the 65% zone lot coverage modification. And the ordinance.
50%.
50%.
50%. The ordinance can be acted upon as present or with the conditions that we just listed.
Support. We got there. Close. No.
The motion close enough, Jake? We kind of know what the intent is. Yep.
Oh, did you second it, Mark?
We
I
have
did.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm
a
sorry.
motion, we have a second. This will actually be a roll call vote.
Anderson,
Yes.
Badger,
Yes.
Clark,
Yes.
Vaughn,
Yes.
Luchet,
Yes.
Mans,
Yes.
Okay.
Yay. Wow.
Well, we finally moved something to had that on the agenda in December of 23 and we
Wow.
concluded. That was a lot of work with all the public
Good having
studies.
a new guy
I
on.
know. Thanks, Joe.
Mr. Chair, if I could, yes, it was a lot of work on your part. So kudos to all of you for making a recommendation to the city council. So from here, the moratorium was set to extend at the, or I'm sorry, extend, it's set to expire at the end of December. Knowing that you were going to be meeting tonight and a little bit more time was needed, staff brought forth to the city council consideration of them extending the moratorium another 3 months. If they prove any changes before that, the moratorium, will essentially end, but next step will be to take this to the city council. They'll review. If they concur, they would adopt. If they have concerns or they want you to look at any additional items, they could send it back to you. So that would be an option of theirs as well. So just to let you know what the next step is. So.
At least we're moving.
That
it
would
for-
be their
At
lump
least
of-
we're moving it forward.
Their lump
Correct.
of coal to us.
A lump of coal.
Back.
Well, it'll be after the holidays when they see it. So.
And that concludes all business. will take us on to the new business, which is the discussion of the short-term rental task force recommendations. In here, I know that Ryan, has taken a task to go through the recommendations that were presented by the short-term rental task force. It was presented to the planning commission back in October, and it was also subsequently presented to city council. The full packet of which portion of which is included in our packets here, but everyone should have had a copy from those meetings. Taking the recommendations and kind of laying out what the recommendation was versus what the current zoning is, and then the recommendation for, I know we used the word police power. Ryan, you may want to kind of extrapolate on what, it's not really a police state. It's a different way of passing an ordinance that becomes impact or becomes effective immediately versus it being in zoning.
Yeah, it's essentially maybe another term for it is that that you may often hear is maybe like a broader regulatory ordinance. So, just generally a police powers ordinance is going to regulate licensing or activities maybe across an entire city, whereas a zoning ordinance or a land use ordinance is getting into more specific requirements about where a particular land use may be allowed in a particular district and certain requirements related to that specific land use in those districts. And so, and I laid this out in a report to you. There's kind of pros and cons to both approaches, but from a staff perspective, right now everything's within your zoning ordinance. So your certificate or licensing, for lack of a better term, is essentially within your zoning ordinance. Your occupancy limits. So a lot of the recommendations that the task force made, we think are better for a broader regulatory or police powers related ordinance. In the case of the planning commission, you certainly have statutory authority to make recommendations on zoning ordinances, and you just did that with the waterfront development project. In this case, there's been cases in the past where the planning commission has been delegated or the council has asked the planning commission to make a recommendation on police power ordinances as well for the city. And so we thought that given that your zoning ordinance would also have to be updated depending on the types of police power ordinance changes that might be implemented, that it may be best for the planning commission to review and make a recommendation on both and have council take both into account. So I mean, that's the quick short of it. If you want to get into like more details beyond my report, as far as, pros and cons, I mean, essentially the police powers ordinance, I mean, if you make changes in your zoning ordinance, and there's some interesting questions because you have a 3-year certificate process. So you kind of have this like use that's like kind of ending after 3 years. Having a police powers ordinance, it's going to apply universally. And then there's not kind of that grandfathering issue. So if you're looking to make changes to your short-term rental regulations, the police powers ordinance is probably a better mechanism at this point. Jake, do you have anything you would like to maybe add that I missed?
Not necessarily. I guess the only thing that I would also add is that, well, a police power ordinance does not, I mean, by default operates both prospectively and retroactively, meaning there's no grandfathering. That can be built into aspects of a police power ordinance if you so desire. So there are ways that a police or regulatory ordinance can be drafted to kind of protect existing uses that are lawfully established, but then also apply some, regulations retroactively. But otherwise, I think you did a great job summarizing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And in short, I don't think, I haven't heard any particular recommendation from the task force or anybody at this point that anybody that has an existing certificate that, that their certificate status would somehow change. Like there might be, certain regulations that they may have to come into compliance with on the police power side. But, if you're 6 months into having a short-term rental certificate, I don't think anybody has suggested so far changing your ability to continue out the remainder of that certificate.
Right. And Joe, correct me if you disagree, but I think the task force, the only time that really came, when we talked about caps, my sense was the task force felt like you don't pull licenses from people who have them, you grandfather them in until the house sells or the, ownership transfer. So
That's correct. Or unless the permit gets pulled for some
Right,
punitive reason.
right.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is to kind of go through each of the ones that are put here in the chart, see if we agree with the recommendation, and if we would like to propose that it would be moved forward via, like, to city council, via a police power, as sometimes it's recommended, or if we think it would be better handled, by us through zoning. So on the first one, it's just on your page 35 in your packet, was underneath the noise. And it was requested the planning commission encourage city council to review the ability to create a noise ordinance for residential districts. Such an ordinance may limit the hours of operation for activities, construction, sound amplifiers, radio, music. This review would seek to enhance the existing citywide noise ordinance to aid in further protecting residential districts. And so the recommendation has been that that would be handled as a police power by city council. So it would go into effect kind of immediately as opposed to. Do we like that as a recommendation?
Just a quick question. I assume this means universally in the city, not just short-term rentals. So if, right?
Residential districts, I think.
That's
but
what I meant.
yeah,
I'm sorry, not
Yep.
commercial, but
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Just a little more context. I mean, what we've discussed with the task force and really the city council recently too, talking about enforcement, is that there's some updates to even your current existing police powers ordinance related to noise that it really could be modernized. Certainly there's extra provisions that could be added in or clarified as far as when maybe there's an expectation that noise really be, kind of brought down at a certain point. And just to clarify too, the intent is to, based on your feedback tonight, is to have, we'll work on drafting some language to bring back to you, both police powers and zoning, for you to review both next month, to dig into.
With more specifics.
You'll actually.
Correct. Yep, you would actually see the language. We would have, you would be able to see red line changes if it's existing or new language. Yeah.
So we like the first one on noise.
I need to understand what Ryan just said. So if we say, yes, there's staff's gonna craft some wording that's gonna deal with what the intent is and what the enforcement plan is and really update the current noise standard with maybe some specifics in different areas, and it would come back to us?
Not an enforcement plan per se, but the language changes would come back to you to review and ultimately make a recommendation back to the council. So for example, like say right now, it's
The regulatory language that would be,
The regulatory language is like how we had it for the waterfront when it came in front
Right.
for us to recommend back to council.
So maybe a simple example would be, say your current noise ordinance said like, you can do whatever you want up until midnight anywhere in the city. And maybe the updated police powers ordinance says, at, 10 or 11 o'clock, like, loud noises and you would word it much better than I would. A certain level of noise or certain types of activities related to noise should maybe, calm down at 10 o'clock. I mean, that would be the type of thing you would be seeing in.
So I think it's currently 11 o'clock, and so there may be certain districts that would say it'd be 10 o'clock. Might be something that might, right?
Could be.
And I think the purpose of trying to go through this tonight was before we would have Jake and the staff draft an ordinance that includes all these, was for us to make certain that it was something that we were comfortable recommending once we see the wording, the regulatory draft of it. Okay, second one was the licensing. Currently, it's a 3-year license. It's been recommended by the fire department and the task force to move them down to an annual or to have annual inspections. So
What's the intent of that change? What is
So the fire chief came to one of our meetings and this is one of their recommendations. I mean, the task force had talked about it as well. Safety, so they find that there are a lot of fire extinguishers that aren't up to code, carbon monoxide. So it's really a safety issue.
And then the cost of this, the change is
So,
considered in our recommendation or something?
So council has talked about, and I think the task force talked about wanting to be sure that any of the changes we make are covered in the fees that are charged. So what's interesting with the fire inspections is even though it would go from 3 years to 1 year, because they would be inspected more frequently, they wouldn't take as long. So the per inspection time would decrease, though the total would increase some.
It's been a little bit since that meeting, but I for some reason recall the fire department mentioned needing to add a person and they were gonna add manpower to do this.
They would need resource to do it, whether it was hiring somebody or either as an employee or as a contract worker, yes.
I think in their budget, if I understand, they have requested for additional personnel, isn't that correct? In the Public
It's-
Works
it's-
area.
I'm not sure what that
And
budget
it's
was.
kind of tricky because they serve all 3 municipalities. So, but yeah, I mean, they would need to increase capacity, obviously, if they're doing more fire inspections.
Is there a way to know what that cost is before we would make a recommendation? Because to make a recommendation not knowing what the cost is dangerous.
Right, so. Yeah, so there's a couple pieces, yeah, so if we're going in a certain direction and that's looking like something we're gonna be, that you'd be recommending or the council may implement, then yeah, that's a conversation we're soon gonna be getting with the fire department, having a discussion about it. I do think it's something that, this might be a situation where we kind of look at, correct me if I'm wrong, probably staggering it or, we'd have to look at implementing it in a certain way to where it's not all of a sudden everybody at once that has to get like a yearly inspection. And, we'd have to find a way to probably incrementally,
But wouldn't it be like
add
on
this,
the
so.
annual of when their license was granted? So if their license was granted in April of 22, they would be subject in April of 24 to an inspection.
Right, and it also might be a situation where maybe they have, 2 years left on their existing certificate on the zoning side, and then maybe once that expires, then they switch over to a yearly, so that way we could, slowly phase this in as well, and so.
So as we say yes today, would we then, before we made the official recommendation, know what those costs from the fire department? Would we have a cost? Because like you said, it goes to all 3 municipalities, so those costs be distributed. How's that gonna get captured?
Well, in terms of the language that would actually be in the ordinance, it would probably just say that there is a, either an application or an inspection fee that's established by resolution of the city council. And that's something that would change over time to reflect changing costs. You wouldn't include actual fee language in the ordinance itself because then you'd have to go through a much more stringent process to change the
But
pricing.
Every taxpayer would see those increased costs from the fire department, not just the STRs. Because the taxpayers pay for the fire department, their prices or their costs went up because we've added a man or added cost.
So there are, I guess, policy considerations as to what the fees should be, but from a legal standpoint, things like application fees you can bake in all of the administrative expenses into the application fee so that basically the people benefiting from that service are the ones paying for it.
And that was the intent that
And-
the short-term rental task force,
Is
You know,
there,
that's how we answered that question, right? Build it into the fee structure.
Yeah.
And
recommendation.
council has been I mean, I think council supports that.
Right, so I think the direction that staff I think has from council is recoup the actual costs, whatever those are, whether they're higher or lower. So I think we switch to something yearly. We're gonna be working with the fire department, to determine what their cost is going to be for each of these. And look at a recommendation to update the fee schedule to the council certainly, but.
So, yeah, it wouldn't be a taxpayer. It would be a short-term rental owner that would be paying.
because there is a recommendation in the task force that says city administration and council will review all costs related to short-term rental when they're evaluating fee changes. But that falls outside the privy of the planning commission.
Understood.
Now, during the task force, I know if we're looking at an annual inspection, we currently have the license for 3 years. Will we saying we still want to leave the license is valid for a 3-year time period?
I thought
If
we
they have
talked
annual
about moving
inspections.
to an annual license.
That's what I thought also.
Because I recall that, but I also remember saying that might be with 300 and some short-term rentals, that's a lot of additional work if they have to do annual licenses. So I do remember some discussion on if it was annual inspections, but the licensing would still be, a 2 or 3-year time period. So when I saw this, I said, well, we're talking about inspection, but it doesn't say anything about a 3-year licensing term.
I am 99% sure that, I mean, everybody who's got a license now, the license is obviously valid for however, until it expires, but then we would move to an annual license. Is that your recollection, Ryan and Joe?
It was mine as well, but
That's certainly an option that could be implemented as part of this. And, even if the fire department's doing, if you have a 3-year license and the fire department's doing an inspection, I mean, there's probably still gonna be some staff time involved with, recording that and, so, yeah, I mean, switching from 3 years to 1 year is gonna be on both sides. That's the inspection side, you're right. On the staff side, certainly, we're gonna have to figure out how to handle that, that workload as well, but,
I haven't seen any city that I was looking at comparisons of that have an annual though license.
You have not seen any other city that had an annual license?
A license.
thought we
Wow.
did.
I can get some data for you on that to take a look at.
And I will say, and maybe I can have more discussions with Ryan about this, but I know some of the communities I've worked with, when they implement new licensing changes, I've seen them basically gradually stagger all the licenses so that the ones that are issued expire basically at the same time every year. And so there's a while for everyone to fall into that, but then once that happens, it's 1 month of the year, that's when all the short-term rentals have to submit their license paperwork and application, and then that's when they're renewed.
Yeah,
And so there are ways, I don't know if that's necessarily something
And the
that
fire-
would be.
I'll be in the same month.
That's where I think
The
we'll have to talk.
inspections would
yeah.
have to be different than the licenses, yeah. But there are ways of,
There's options.
approaching that to remove the administrative burden.
Assuming staff could handle it and, I can't speak to that obviously, but it's sort of like a car, the emissions inspection, you have to have your emission inspection done before you get your license, I know not in Michigan, but in other states.
Violating the law for. a long
So
time.
you have a period of time to get that done before you submit to get your tag. I don't, you don't really probably care about
No.
solving that problem, but I mean, I know you care about solving the problem, but I don't
Right.
need to solve it for you.
No, this is, it's a big change and, I've been giving it some thoughts and, but wanted to kind of see what direction we're headed before giving it a whole lot more time and study. So, but we will dive into these details, certainly.
That's why I'm struggling to make a recommendation without knowing what the details are,
Yeah, and I will say that this is, well, I guess makes it a little bit tricky about sending a police powers ordinance or asking the planning commission for police powers ordinance related recommendation because, zoning and land use, you're not necessarily there to consider the cost pieces to it. That's typically more of a policy decision of the city council. And I can understand how that those things are natural questions that would come into mind for you, certainly. So.
CJ asked the question about why have annual fire inspections? Why have annual licensing versus 3? And my gut is that we should do annual licensing. Not sure, it's truly just gut. What would be the advantage of annual licensing versus say 3-year licensing?
Yeah, so to me, I just see it all coming in one. Right now, it's a 3-year certificate that you get an inspection for, and then it's good for a 3-year period. I see an annual license corresponding with, to get that license, you have your inspection, you pay your fee that we collect that helps goes toward, implementing the entire program and enforcement.
Right, I think one of the advantages of an annual is that if city council makes a change to the fee structure, so if we determine that it's costing a larger amount and you want to change the fee structure for a license,
Okay,
it's effective the very next year as opposed to
okay.
somebody just paid it and now they don't have to have that increase for 3 years.
I think it's also easier for people to understand if everything happens once a year, then you don't have to think, well, what's 3 years, what's 1 year? And also it would spread the revenue out. You wouldn't have, ebbs and valleys or whatever, dips and troughs in revenue. Because you would just every year come in with a licensing fee.
Okay.
It'd definitely be easier to try to see, are we covering our cost annually?
And right now, your current certificate process is also, like I said, you have to have the inspection, but you're not issued your certificate until you have your inspection as well. So it's kind of that, yeah, they
Sure.
kind of go hand in hand.
Two come together.
Right, okay.
So right now for the recommendation, we would like to see it go to an annual licensing and inspection.
Correct.
Are we saying, as we say yes, are we saying we just said yes to that, or?
I'm just-
what are we doing?
Right now, I'm just saying.
Is there consensus
the
for them to
consensus,
put some
so we can
language
move on to the
together?
next one.
Okay,
I mean, we're still going to have it drafted and see it in,
okay.
This is only the first of,
right.
Correct.
But again, if it's something where everybody's against it, then I don't want to bother
Right.
drafting it.
True, please, yes.
Right.
My sentiment is that, yes, there is consensus.
Yes, that's what I feel too. So we're moving on to fire safety recommendation number 2. Explore reducing the occupancy limits that align more with single-family residential. Such reduced occupancy would entail allowing 2 persons per bedroom with a maximum of 12 persons per dwelling.
And this was something the fire chief felt very strongly about in that, houses burn down really fast and they feel like 12 people they can get out of a burning building. More than that, they really think it's a threat to life.
I sort of recall the comments there. I'm concerned, why only STRs? Why would we not have that same safety concern for every residence? And why would those lives be less important than the STR people?
Well, we're not saying it's less important, but the STRs are asking for a license to operate and rent their homes. If somebody buys a home, we don't have the right to regulate how many people are in their family or that they want to have
The
live in.
business use.
But we do have the ability to put restrictions on something when they're asking for a license to do it, to use it in another fashion than just a pure residential home. In my opinion. Now, the one thing that I have seen with a lot of other communities is that they've done this where they give 2 people per bedroom and then 2 additional people per finished floor, still with the same maximum of like 12. So like if you have a 2-bedroom home and you have a sleeper sofa, or if 1 bedroom has 2 queen beds in it, you would be allowed 6 people. As opposed to right now, if we just limit it to 2 per bedroom, it'd be a 4-person. And almost the majority that I've seen have written it as 2 persons per bedroom and then 2 people per finished floor. So if you had a 4-bedroom home, that would put them at the max. That would be 8 people per bedrooms. If it's assuming a 2-story house, I should say, for
In the current code, the current setup follows, I believe, very much that. That's how they currently generate the occupancy. The fire department determines what the occupancy is on their investigation. When they go and do theirs, they tell you how many people.
right. But currently that many times is higher than the number of 12.
Correct. So the current ordinance requires that the fire department use the Boca property maintenance code. And yeah, essentially it's 2 people per bedroom and 2 per floor, but there's just not a max ceiling on total occupancy. So, if you have a 1-bedroom house and you can have 2 per floor, then you're going to set it at 4. So you're suggesting that if you have like a larger bedroom that can
No,
accommodate more beds, or
suggesting that we would make it consistent with the 2 per bedroom plus the 2 per floor, with a limit of 12.
Yeah, essentially, I think
again-
that's what would be probably drafted. There would just be a max on the,
Correct. Because right now, with the way that the recommendation is in there, if you had a 3-bedroom, you would be limited to 6 as opposed to 8 or 10 potentially.
I'm okay with that. I
Yeah.
mean, I know not everyone feels that way, but I would be okay with limiting it to 2 per bedroom. It helps keep short-term rentals more in line with how most of the houses in our neighborhoods are populated. So we don't have, houses filled with up to 12 people right behind me and across the street from me.
Well, to get to the 12, you'd have to have a 4-bedroom house on 2 stories.
Talk to me about enforcement. How is it gonna be enforced?
Inspections.
I think we have to, I mean, a lot of things we can't always enforce. I mean, people drive down the street at 45 miles down, and we don't always catch that. But I think having the regulation there, I mean, obviously, we're not going to knock on doors and do bedroom checks. But it gives property managers and short-term rental owners of incentive to limit the number of people in their neighborhood businesses. If there does become an issue, we do have some clout to,
Well, it also limits when they're advertising the
right.
property. So if they're advertising the property and it's a 2-bedroom home, they would not be allowed to advertise more than, 4 or 6, depending upon how the limitation is.
I disagree with this particular.
What
I-
part do you just?
It's punitive to a big house. If I have a big monster house, I can't use it as.
So you object to the maximum of
Yeah, I
12?
do. The current, the BOCA standards that they follow, I think if they're safe enough for a family to live there, then I'm not sure what why I'd want to do anything different than that.
I think.
Well,
that-
I will say that in addition to the safety issues that the fire chief brought up, we've, as part of the task force, heard a lot of public comment from people who resided around these larger capacity houses, and it seemed that a majority of the complaints, nuisance complaints, seem to be centering around that. So I think there was an additional,
And I've heard those, so let's deal with those issues, and that's why we have the noise policy, we got a trash one coming up and some of those things, so I don't know why we're punitive on this issue, but not really the problems noise, problems trash.
I think if we had other commercial businesses where we didn't feel like we could safely deal with a fire, we would take that seriously. I mean, I don't want to be one who opposes a regulation that the fire chief recommends in terms of saving human life. Plus, it does help keep our neighborhoods homes that are being run as businesses feel more like the homes that they were built to be.
Just to add, what I recall from the chief, and I believe he had a little bit, more data on it. So like, for example, you may have a hotel that may have, a high occupancy, but you also have different fire code standards for a hotel. And his concern was that most fires are happening in, single family dwellings, and that their fire code and is very different, and that his concern is getting above that 12 number is with knowing like how quickly a single family home can go up in flames with the fire code standards that it has, like how quickly can he get out, that many people, safely, and his concern with these larger homes that he's like, I'm not sure that we can, given what he knows about fire. That was what I understood from his recommendation.
Okay.
So,
I
yeah.
still disagree with this.
No, that's fair. Yep.
I'd like to see the 2 per bedroom plus 2 per finished floor. I think it's too restrictive if somebody's got a 1 or 2 bedroom place to say that they can only have 4 people. 2 people or 4 people, knowing that many homes who have multiple kids have two full-size beds in a room and they might have 3 or 4 children sleeping in there. We're not letting them have any excess number. Because again, to get to the 12, they would have to have 4 bedrooms on 2 floors. And so if they have a house that's any larger than that, they're going to max out at 12.
I mean, yeah, I think so, I see CJ's point about that the larger homes are being penalized at limiting at 12, but I'll tell you, the house I moved into, they turned the dining room into a bedroom and they turned a designated art studio above a garage into a bedroom. So that house became from 4 bedrooms to 6. Then if your suggestion was you get to add 2 more on.
Still maxes
couches.
out at 12 though.
Well, what I'm saying is if we remove the 12-person limitation, because now all of a sudden a house has 6 bedrooms, or let's say a pre-existing house has 6 bedrooms. I think there's some of those in town. It just seems, I'm on both sides. I'll be quite honest with you, because I think if we just left it at 2 persons per bedroom, period. I think, and as you were saying, there were other suggestions we're making to address the problems that too many people present, whether it be noise, trash, parking.
And we don't have good enforcement strategy for it either.
Yeah, I mean, the other side is there's a 2-bedroom house 3 doors down from me that there are routinely 6 cars parked in front. And it's not when they're visiting. There are 6 cars that people are staying in that residence. So, even at a minimum of 1 person per car, which are usually, they show up in 2s, so that gets further on to like the idea of the registry. Talk about enforcement. I want a registry where I know the allowed occupancy of a structure. And then if I pull up my big boy pants and go down and knock on the door and say, hey, you're only allowed to have 4 people and you've got 8. But I think if we just limit it to 2 per bedroom,
With no maximum.
I think, I know people who have come up to town and there's a large group of people stay in a single house and, I believe the places they're staying accommodate them. They're not throwing sleeping bags on the floors of the living room or something.
Well, I think the dilemma is, we have a fire chief who said that it's problematic, if there's a fire, to get more than 12 people out of the house safely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
Then why would he approve or put occupancy of greater than in anyone's house? Yeah, any house, whether SDR or not, that's.
I don't know that he has. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just saying that that's problematic when you have your fire chief saying that.
And this is regulating a business, not regulating residents living in their homes. I mean, I think that's very different. And in terms of enforcement, one of the ways you help get at that is by requiring occupancies to be listed in advertisements. So, I mean, people always break the laws, but at least that helps set the parameters for what's acceptable for each house that's put up for rent.
Don't we currently do that? We currently on our certificates to have the occupancy documented.
All right. So it would be, if you had a 3-bedroom house, it would be 6. Or, if you had a 6-bedroom house, it would be 12. But you couldn't advertise
If I had 8-bedroom house, it would. still
be 12.
That's the part.
Well, punitive or not, the dilemma remains. You've got a fire chief who's on record as saying this.
So the consensus I'm hearing is that most people are okay with having a 12 limit.
Yep.
Okay, so we're good with the 12 limit. Are we just gonna stay at 2 per bedroom or 2 per bedroom plus 2 per floor?
I'm wondering that would be a pretty minor tweak to the language of the ordinance if we added the 2 per floor. I mean, should,
That's what's in there currently, so
okay.
I think we'd be leaving it the same and just only kind of changing it to a 12 max.
As long as it's max to 12.
I could live with that.
Okay. Next one is the.
Continue.
Yeah.
The requirement for a local agent or a management company. Currently, it's 45 miles radius. During the task force, the chart that we have even in the recommendation showed a radius of 25 miles, 35 miles, and 45 miles. I'm not certain this got written up as 15. I'm not certain where the 15 came from because as 15, you've eliminated Holland as well as South Haven. And to get Holland and South Haven, which have a lot of management companies, if somebody was going to go that route, we would have to have the 25-mile radius. And I think the intention was to make certain that if something did happen, that the owners or the agents would be closer than 45 miles. So on that one, I was going to recommend 25-mile radius versus the 45.
I think that.
That's
that works for
reasonable.
me.
Yep.
Okay. Next falls into require the short-term rental certificate be posted in a window visible from the public roadway in order to identify the property as having been issued a permit to operate as a short-term rental. Currently, we have no requirement on that. The task force recommended that. I personally am in favor of that. Anyone else?
So I'm interested in intent again. I'm afraid it becomes a target. It's now a house that maybe isn't always occupied. Somebody wandering by can feel they can go look in the window because they see the certificate or they want to go read the certificate. The scarlet letter of sorts. Why do I need to put that on?
Yeah.
Especially when we get to the registry, everyone knows where those are and it's available to them.
Yeah, and I will note, and I'm not exactly sure what the South Haven language, what that looks like. I think kind of when they came up with the language, ended up kind of adding in like from the public roadway that this could be, the certificate could be viewed because when I talked with the South Haven planning director, it indicated they were having some problems, exactly like you were mentioning, with some folks maybe going up and supposedly looking at the certificate, but not really looking at the certificate and looking in the windows and doing some things that they had some concerns with. So.
I would be okay with deleting this if we were to proceed with a registry, a publicly accessible registry.
Because that's one, Ryan and Jake, that's not in here that a number of us have talked about, that was the idea that we would want to have a registry that would be accessible. You know, we put through our website where somebody can look up and say the address, does it have a license? What's their occupancy? Who's their contact person?
So right now you, for the most part, already have that, believe it or not. There's a public facing side of our BSNA software that does allow somebody to look up and see if there's an active short-term rental certificate. You can actually look up, you know, if there's enforcements, prior permits, everything. It doesn't show a contact information for like who's responsible. That's something that I did talk with South Haven about as well. And they kind of, you can talk with BSA and turn on certain features. So now we haven't promoted that. We haven't like educated the community on that, but that's something that, you know, we have that's existing that we could utilize more. But
I'm
it's
not
already out
familiar
there.
with it.
So.
Yeah, I think that would work. And one thing that I know Representative Andrews in his proposal, that's hopefully a bill that will hopefully come to light, that it does include actually a statewide registry. So, and that would then relieve some cost burden from the city, which would be nice.
Did I just hear you say that I, as a citizen, can go look at, I can access online our licenses and that includes the occupancy and contact info?
What I'm saying, it doesn't have like the detail of occupancy and contact information yet.
Okay.
Those are features that we can, my understanding is have the software company turn on to be public facing. But you can see if somebody has a valid short-term rental certificate on a particular property.
And is that the City of Saugatuck website?
It's not directly on our website. If you were to Google, City of
gonna say-
Saugatuck BSNA, is what it's called. There is a,
You can get to it from the Allegan County website, I think.
BSNA.
Say what?
Yep, BSNA. So I can set it out to show you just what it looks like. And actually just the other day gave somebody some
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
instructions on how to do that. So.
Yeah,
Didn't
but I
know
think
you
if,
said
if we
that.
have something like that linked to our own website,
Information on Russ's
I could kind of
Help
see the website having a short-term rental drop down, like a whole section where we got like boards and committees. It's got a short-term rental.
Link or something.
And then when you drop down, it's got, that's where you'd also have like the good neighbor policies posted, and you would have violations and fines and the registry.
Yeah,
for
no,
people to
and
be able to
that's,
look
yep, perfect. Good idea. And, you know, we've kind of held off on putting all that together just because I don't know what the final, like, I want to like develop an FAQ, but I don't know what the final changes might be. So it'll be kind of a, once we have, you know, an idea of where we're headed, we'll certainly get something like that done.
So if we had a registry, and would we still want to have a requirement that the license has to be posted?
I would say not.
No. So we would take recommendation 6 out in lieu of
Mhm.
a registry.
Yes.
On item 7, this one, Ryan, I'm going to ask you because since we have kind of talked about how when it comes to assessing fines and monetary, it's like kind of outside of zoning, but this one here was encourage a review of assessing monetary fines and fees for property owners who are in violation of the short-term rental ordinances and the fire department requirements. Such fines would be tracked in an enforcement database. And then we've gotten down as both zoning and police power, but it does relate to, determining dollar amounts.
Yeah, well, because there's, I guess, two pieces, just in general, there's, you know, you could be violating your license provisions, or you could be violating a zoning ordinance provision, such as you're operating in a district where you're not allowed to have a short-term rental or something. So there's penalties that could apply to both. So
Got it. Okay.
Currently, you
Currently.
enforcement of, I see your list, we have enforcement, you send letters, you send fines, as an escalation clause as those things continue.
correct, there's escalating fees for first, second, and third violation. Yep.
So I don't know I'm trying to understand what's the recommendation different from what we have currently?
Well, I know one thing that the task force recommended is that, I mean, the fees now are pretty small, is that we look at putting some teeth in the fees so that people actually might be deterred. So I think it's like $125 now for the first violation. Is that correct, Ryan?
For a zoning violation, it's
Yeah.
100.
So maybe upping some of the fees so that,
Well, because we talked about if you can send an enforcement letter, but if we actually had to go to court or something to try to collect, our out of pocket would be substantially greater than what the fine that we'd be collecting. And so it was trying to make it to where like some cities have, a $500, type of initial fine.
So we're looking to recommend an update to the fines that are assessed by the city. What are we looking to recommend?
That's how I interpreted this, was to look not at whether or
Not
not
just-
they exist at all, but looking at, are they,
We're basically just recommending council take a look at increasing increasing what is considered a violation and then the cost of that violation. And I think then there's one other level to it is, do you have a maximum number of violations before you lose your license? And we did discuss that.
I think that goes a little further down.
Mhm.
Talked
Is that
about
coming up?
application, yeah.
It is.
Yeah, 'cause I couldn't remember if yes. it
You
is.
said what includes, so you're looking to have different items that get fines? Is what, I understand we have current fee structure for certain fines. And we're recommending that they look at those prices and increase them, so be it, but yeah.
Because
are we
Ryan,
looking at any?
because right now I don't have a listing of all the ones that are considered fines, but are there fines for somebody who has broken a noise ordinance? Is there a fine for somebody who is not, overflowing their garbage cans? I don't know if those are currently in place.
They are.
and also fines for people who don't get a license
That was.
or who are operating without a license, and making those
Correct.
meaningful.
That was actually part of the genesis of the discussion because why even bother applying for a permit, if you're gonna pay $100, you know, you get away with it for 2 years, right?
And I think there's another good one later that sort of takes care of that issue, but I'm supportive of having them look at the fine structure. I don't think we're talking about adding new fines or recommendations, any new.
Well, there would be at least one new fine because there's going to be an entirely new police power ordinance for short-term rentals. And so that'll have its own separate, fee schedule that wouldn't be processed under the normal zoning violations.
I'm not sure.
Or it could subsume the current violations and fee schedule we have now. If we put, let's say, a noise, additional noise, say 10 o'clock instead of 11 o'clock. If we penalize somebody for doing after 11 o'clock now, it's still the same penalty. It's just we're moving it from 11 o'clock to 10 o'clock. Right? I mean, if
I think that's one component of the changes that are being suggested, but the other one, I think the most obvious thing it would apply to would be like operating a short-term rental without a certificate or without a license. And there's no separate fine for that. I mean, that'd just be, correct me if I'm wrong, that'd just be a zoning violation subject to that same $100 fine, but with a separate police power ordinance specifically addressing short-term rentals, you can set what a fine for, first, second,
see.
third
Okay.
violation of that
That's
would
the
be.
specific fine you're talking about. If somebody were in violation of the short-term rental guidelines or whatever they are, then that's the new fine, and it would have a new rate that would be set by city council.
Correct.
All right,
Supportive, if that's the
Supportive?
only, if that's the only added item,
okay. The next one was required documentation for a short-term rental property's insurance company to identify it's insured as a rental dwelling. To me, it makes total sense that it should be, their insurance should know that they're using it as a short-term rental.
Is that the city's job? I just don't know why what's the intent? They don't check if I have my car insurance. They don't, so what's the intent?
Well, it's people operating a business in the city and just making sure they're insured.
You keep saying that, but I'm not sure that's necessarily true for all the short-term rentals, but I don't know why the city would want to have to tell them how to insure their property. If they choose to not insure it, isn't that at their risk, their peril?
They can choose the not covering.
State requires cars to be insured. There's certainly a certain amount of liability that comes with, opening your home up to a short-term rental. And I think that was part of the decision process, was making sure that people were actually notifying their insurance company to ensure that there's proper, liability and protection coverage over those dwellings.
Yeah, if the city permits something, then it's basically what risk does it assume?
Are we recommending a level of coverage or?
I'm just asking, I'm just.
Yeah, and I think it was more that the policy recognized that the home would be used as a rental. And if maybe there's certain clauses that would then be required by the insurance company because there would be other people outside of the immediate family that could potentially be harmed in that property.
And this was a suggestion of the fire department, so I can circle back with the chief to see,
Right.
get a little more detail on what they were thinking along those lines. I know they do cost recovery in certain, circumstances. So perhaps,
I'm supportive of more investigation of it, because I just don't know,
Right.
why.
Okay. Yeah, we can-
Do business, but I can understand having a further discussion.
Okay.
And I think there's a significant differentiation if you are looking as a regulation. I have a little problem with keep hammering on the phrase police power. City regulation between property insurance and liability insurance. Both in terms of people who are staying in the rental and people who, and I'm thinking of non-owner occupied rental dwellings. the liability of that. If it burns down and it's your property, well, you didn't insure it for property, then you take that loss. But if I'm walking down if a delivery person or somebody's putting a package on my front porch, or I'm walking down the sidewalk in front of it, or if there's a branch of a tree that falls on me, I think the city does have an obligation to make sure that there is some coverage for people who both stay there and who go past it or somehow are involved with it. So that's my own point, with differentiate between liability insurance line. And again, back to your thing about cars. You don't have to insure your car if for your property, if it's destroyed, but you have to have liability. So it's analogous.
Right.
Is a thought.
That's to what level are we requiring? That's, yeah.
And I think it also comes down, many cities, and this was kind of discussed in the task force, have a distinction between like two different types of short-term rentals. There's ones that they call like a personal short-term rental and a business short-term rental. Personal short-term rental would be someone who's living in their home, let's say 50 out of the 52 weeks. And while they're on vacation for 2 weeks, they rent their home out. That has, totally a different feel than somebody who buys a property with the intention of renting it every week for the entire year. And so many places have kind of made a distinction between personal short-term rentals and business short-term rentals. That none of ours things really relate to that, but that is like in that situation, if it was somebody who was only letting somebody use their home 1 or 2 weeks a year, would they have the same requirement? But
That is a slippery slope, like, okay, what level of liability,
Right.
100,000, 500,000? $5?
For rental,
Yeah, exactly.
that's
I mean, I don't know. I mean, do we want to get into that? That's, yeah. Not a bad point.
Moving
so
on.
we're okay with just more investigation. Moving on, then we've got recommendations, short-term rental property were originally built and issued certificates of occupancy as short-term rental dwellings under the Michigan Residential Code. Renting a single-family dwelling to the public on a tentative or transient basis mirrors a commercial or business-like change of use that can trigger other requirements. This one I have to say, I need a further explanation on.
Yeah, I don't understand.
I think that was more, kicking that to Jake and his colleagues to say, if we look at, are there other things that should be going on if we consider these, a single family dwellings being used for a different purpose? And the answer might be no.
I'm not
still
sure I
confused.
understand the question. I think, the way I read it was probably more of a statement from the fire department. I think some of it gets into more of a, maybe a perspective, or it does get into some legal analysis as far as whether or not it's a commercial use within a residential zoning district, those types of factors.
That might be
That,
worth
and I think like to your, as Holly was just saying, if it turns out that you viewed it as a quasi business, are there other requirements that we have on businesses that we don't currently have on the residential besides like saying the insurance? Are there other ones that we would potentially want to look at?
Okay, yeah, that's certainly something we can look into when we,
And it might be a short call with Janik too, to see if he has experience with something that we should look into.
So I have trouble recommending it without understanding that.
So I think our recommendation would only be to kind of look at, is there things that we potentially didn't see in the task force that we would want to consider that we require for a residential business that's not currently required for a short-term rental? If that makes sense.
Yeah, we can, we'll circle back.
Right. Next was in regards to the trash, was to encourage the planning commission to explore and modify the short-term rental ordinance to require all short-term rentals certified to have an additional residential dumpster for every 4 persons of occupancy. Example, if a short-term rental has an occupancy limit of 8, they require 2 containers. If it was 10 or 12, they require 3. I know that I personally think it should be 6 people per container, because I think having more than 2 containers if we're having a 12-person limit on a home is probably overkill, because when we do see overflows, I've never seen an overflow that's greater than what a second container would be.
I'm gonna go with my continued theme of the night, the intent. I assume the intent is to not have overflowing garbage. I don't think it's just, it's anybody's overflowing garbage, and we have rules against that. Why are we just not enforcing those rules as opposed to making a different recommendation? Personally, I have one garbage can I pay for, but if I have overflowing garbage, I have my own personal one that the garbage man picks up. When I get too many Amazon packages, so.
I think the issue is not everyone is responsible and as you are to deal with their excess garbage with their own garbage can. So I think both trash and recycling for short-term, I think, and I agree with Steve, two's probably right. And what's tricky there are people, I mean, one of the task force members rents her house, I think out in August or something. And so would we require her to get an extra garbage can for 1 month? But the trash is definitely an issue we want to be able to get to.
But trash is an issue, everybody's trash is an issue, no? So I think it's an enforcement of what I think is a current thing. Overflowing trash is a citable issue, no?
Correct. I think this kind of, suggestion is to be maybe a little more proactive and just have the cans there, the short-term rental there, the intensity of that use is more frequent than maybe a family living in a single family dwelling that doesn't have maybe the trash load in the same way, or maybe they do. I mean, maybe they get more Amazon packages. So I think that's fair to have that discussion. So.
It's kind of getting into the push-pull type of thing, right? Where are you gonna send out the masses to write, citations for properties that are constantly, that are overflowing their garbage? Or do you want to be proactive and say you have to have enough capacity to support the occupancy load of your house? And it is one of those where there's no real right or wrong, final answer, right?
But I do think that if
I think in a perfect world.
but if you do have 2 trash cans, I think the likelihood of the overflow is much less, which means we don't have to have somebody walking around writing.
That was the thought.
Yeah.
I hate making rules to fix a problem that's not really fixing the problem necessarily. And the rule is, the problem is we have too much trash overflowing. It's not that we don't have enough garbage cans.
Or both.
Well, one may cause the other, but that's, the problem is the overflowing garbage, not the lack of trash cans.
What I heard from the community and from the task force members, and even from my own personal, knowing that we've got like 4 or 5 short terms around us, the overflow, I've never seen it great enough to fill a second can, but it's overflowing to the point that you can't close the can. And when raccoons and things get in it overnight, and it's all over the street the next morning, that would not occur if there was 2 cans. Because the one house that's right directly next to me, they actually did take, like you did, they were very responsible and they went and got 2 cans. I never see those overflowing.
It's not a hill to die on. I don't
I
have
know.
a problem with it. I just think we're looking at, not looking at the actual problem, we're looking at something else, but okay.
Well, one of the problems was trash and the,
Oh, yeah, I'm
overflow
not
of it.
supportive of
And so it's-
enforcing trash.
Yep.
I don't like trash.
and this was a.
And I'm sticking
Do we think of the 6th person, which would be 2 cans, would be acceptable?
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on. To encourage city administration to review the ability to revoke a license for a short-term rental if multiple complaints are validated within a 12-month period. Further encourage such a review to establish what is classified as a violation in the documentation process. I think that's probably one we can all agree with.
A lot of details to be added there,
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah,
as
yeah.
a rule, or to have something like that, okay.
I mean, it's just obviously, once you know what the violations are, if it, we just have to set, is it 2 violations, is it 3 violations, whatever, then you can't have your license renewed. Okay. Request the city administration review the feasibility of requiring short-term rental properties to post their certificate numbers when listing their properties for rent, such as on Airbnb and VRBO. I'm 100% in
Very
favor of this
supportive.
one. I didn't know it was possible until the short-term rental task force,
Yeah,
learned
exactly.
it.
Somebody was online and said that was.
Yeah, and I was just like, absolutely.
90% of the rogue issues will be taken care of then.
Yep.
Develop a good neighbor guide and have it available as well as on our website. I think we're all in agreement with.
I'm sorry, just a little bit of my thoughts on this. So we have the fire department, there's things that have to be posted already from them. It should just be added to that requirement. So it's not only your modes of egress, all that, but here's your quiet hours. Here's those other expectations of the guests.
Yep.
Very supportive.
Is this, the one question I had on this, is this something that requires an ordinance or is it simply something administratively that can be done to develop a good neighbor policy?
Well, I think, the way I guess I envision this is, is probably at some point we develop, maybe as a city, a template, but that there be some requirement that it be posted along with anything else that's required to be posted.
All right.
So,
It's not the development of it, but the implementation of it.
correct. So, I mean, the intent is that people that are coming and staying are getting at least some information about and reminders of, living in a community where there's people that are living here and, sharing, spaces responsibly and informing them about this kind of regulations that the city may have, such as when, noise should calm down or something along those
I'm
lines.
sure most of them do, but it's another spot that'll put it.
You're right.
In their face. It'll put it in their
Yep.
face one more time, whether they
Right.
choose to read it or not, to be theirs again.
Right, exactly. That's why one page at max is.
Yeah.
And I think, so then what we want to take a look at was there any ones we disagreed with? We've already kind of talked about each of those. Question two was, is there additional recommendations? I think the one that we've already laid out was the idea of having a registry that's available for us to be able to view, has the property number, whether they have a license, occupancy, as well as contact information.
The other thing with the trash is, I think we should consider also, requiring people have an extra recycling. Because actually recycling is often, gets overloaded. And our city clerk was mentioning at our planning meeting yesterday, one of the most frequent calls she gets is for people, short-term rentals, tourists saying, what do I do with all my recycling? And so,
So that could be, it could be two sides to that one. One of the other recommendations that's not on this list that the task force made was to, have the city administration look at negotiating more frequent pickups. So
Right.
Maybe the
So
more
that
frequent
might be-
pickups
yeah.
addresses that issue. Well,
Yeah.
our contract's up in October,
Right.
we'll work to try to get some language in there to at least probably twice monthly.
And that was true, because in the recommendations that's in our kit, we didn't put in the ones that were recommended for city administration to review or city administration, to consider, even council, because like one of the great ideas was let's have twice a month pickups, April through September. When you have more activity, like on recycle. So but that's kind of outside of what we would want to do as far as,
Twice a month or twice a week?
right now, recycle's only once a
Oh,
month.
recycle.
So the
I'm
idea,
sorry.
so I was talking about for the
Like
recycling.
you're gonna do it less?
So if you're looking at it, it's citywide. You're not gonna have
right.
recycling pickup
Right.
just twice a week at.
Exactly.
short-term
That's why it
rentals
doesn't
from
really
August
relate
to-
just to short-term rental. That's more of a conversation for the entire city,
Right, and
which
at
is,
least in my house, I recycle more maybe now than I do in August. So to put a month limitation on it, I'm not sure.
that's out, but that's for the city council on that to review. The only other one that I know that was in there, and I think we're gonna have probably be looking at it in 24 was parking, the issue of parking, because currently I think we have a requirement in our short-term rentals, like for 2 spaces, but it's hard to enforce. But we do have a parking issue, and we know that some streets, when we have all of guests and people parking on both sides of the street, like Pleasant, it's a safety hazard. They can't really get through if you had an issue and up on the hill. I don't think it needs to be part of the initial ordinance, but I do think it's probably something we're gonna need to look at as a planning commission in 24. And Ryan, I think you probably have heard some of the same things.
Yeah, I think parking came up quite a bit yesterday at the council's strategic planning session. I think right now there's not a specific like parking requirement for short-term rentals. It's kind of based on whatever a single family dwelling would be required to have. So, in general, that's, 2 per household. Now, if you have an accessory dwelling unit, you have to have an additional parking space. That puts you at 3. Certainly around the commercial districts down here, there's not a parking requirements. I do think that if you have parking concerns or want like maybe additional parking requirements for short-term rentals, that's probably a district by district discussion that should be in your zoning ordinance. And you probably should have it, you can have this discussion. Now, I mean, you can send changes at different points in time,
Exactly.
so
Right.
if that's something that you want to study a little further for changes.
I think we do
certainly,
have to look at it from a study. I just had it written down as something when we say, is there other recommendations?
Right.
At this time, I don't think we can make it. But I do want it noted that I think parking needs to be reviewed.
I don't,
I-
I mean, I sort of somewhat disagree and somewhat agree. This is always what we do on parking. We always put it off.
Yeah.
As long as
Well-
I've been around, this is what we do. We'll talk about it next year. I find it incredible that it's not addressed here, considering the issue that it is. But I'm willing to have more patience, but not a lot more patience.
Right. But it needs to be a priority for us because right now we didn't
Well, it
get in.
isn't.
I know I'm saying it. For like right now, these are things that we think we can get through based on the information that came from the task force and from the community. The parking one, kind of like the next topic of caps, probably requires more discussion on the various ways you can go about dealing with it. And we can't send that through tonight, so that's why it would have to be a,
Can we note to council that while parking is not specifically addressed in this tranche, that there is going to be another tranche coming?
yes.
It's going to address parking as well as probably caps.
Yeah, and I think council is very anxious to get this moving forward.
They want to get something started.
Get this started, but to Bobby's point, parking and caps sooner rather than later, like soon.
And it needs
So
to be
it's-
in writing to council that it's coming.
Yeah.
That we just haven't, I mean, because if we say nothing, if nothing goes in writing, it's not part of the record, then again, we'll be sitting here a year from now talking about this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I can be behind that.
A question. I don't know the answers. Do we have an ordinance prohibiting parking on, just parking on your lawn? I mean, where it's not improved, not an improved surface, not a driveway, not a parking pad. Can people just park on their lawn?
Yes, I think that's my reading of your current ordinances. I think it's,
So I wondered.
so,
And Ryan, what I'm
Um,
wondering for like January's meeting, could we have a summary of what our parking rules are currently? I mean, we can also back and read it, but
so.
I would like to have it as an agenda item.
Specific to like STRs
No,
or?
just, I think the city and then STRs, if there's any differential between them.
I'm also curious if there's any appetite among I guess, the planning commission chair and then the commissioners to maybe have some special meetings to get through. I'm afraid with parking and caps, I mean, our next meeting's a month from now and, it'll take a couple meetings, which means that we aren't going to get anything to city council until, I think generously, I mean, maybe March or April at a monthly cadence, and that puts us a year after the task force started meeting, which it just feels like if we could maybe double up on some meetings, I would love that. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think council would love to get some of this moving. I mean, this is really meaty and important, but the big issues really are caps. And I think to Bobby's point too, parking.
And to that point, and again, everybody's gonna have their opinion. When we started studying it, when we were listening to a lot of the consultants, many cities who impose different type of rules and regulations, and Jake, you might be able to, comment on this. They started their process and many times it was 2 or 3 years before they got to a point of making changes. And, so the fact that we're coming in ways, yes, we've got some further to go, but you know, I still think that we've done a lot in 1 year. Jake, what is,
Yeah, certainly. I mean, every community is different and a project like this is a big one. There's a lot of competing interests. I mean, I guess I can't say, you know, whether
1 year is appropriate or 2?
1 year is appropriate or not. Every project like this kind of stands by
Well, the
itself.
issue has certainly been around and kicked down the road. I mean, if this were 5 years ago, I mean, you look at where we were a year ago with short-term rentals and the number of certificates and where we are now. I mean, it just keeps going up. And so I get, you know, we don't want to be hasty but the committee, the task force did a lot of work. So I guess I'm hoping we can move with, as Helen would say, alacrity.
Yeah. Well, I think that what we're recommending to move forward to be able to see this now drafted up in ordinance is virtually everything except for parking and caps that came up during the task force. So those will be two, you know, items that will be heavier conversations.
I like,
What's that?
nothing.
Okay. So we know that we want to designate parking. Number 3 that was on here. Do we wish to evaluate further the idea of having caps in residential neighborhoods?
Yes.
Absolutely. So my opinion, a year ago, so this is my 1 year anniversary. A year ago, this has started. We sat here very deliberatively. We decided who were the shareholders. We were gonna say who was gonna make up this task force. Spent a lot of time, city council came up with that. Short-term rental spent a lot of time looking at that. And there was no consensus to a cap. So I don't understand why we spend all that time and now we're talking about maybe some individuals or personal agendas to get the caps. When all of that thought process was put to this STR group that didn't recommend caps of any kind.
They didn't not recommend them either. They said that there wasn't consensus.
And what I guess we're asking is, as a group, knowing that I don't want to spend the time this evening doing it, but do we want to designate time in our January meetings to investigating the potential benefit of caps? And if so, what information would we need in addition to what we found to be somewhat inconclusive?
So one other thing we didn't gather that was, we had South Haven's example, but of the economic impact of the restriction or reduction of tourism. What would be the impact to the businesses downtown and the impact to restaurants in retail?
I would love for us to, if, you know, everyone agrees, Charlevoix, which is comparable demographically to Saugatuck and economy, I think as a city can be, implemented residential caps 18 months ago. I'm forgetting the time frame, but it's been very successful. None of the sort of doom and gloom scenarios that people feared came true. Their head of planning has said he'd be happy to talk with anyone in the city. I think having, you know, zooming him in could be beneficial information. I mean, I think they've been through it. They've seen, you know, I think they've made some tweaks. I think that could be some good information. And there are other consultants who all they do is is short-term rental consulting. We might be able to draw upon some of those resources.
And I would agree. I think the one thing that I know that Holly and myself and then Ryan have had the opportunity, and maybe have 1 or 2 other people on the task force to participate in some of the consultative type of seminars, webinars that took place. Some individuals who help many cities in structuring and determining, you know, if you're going to put a cap in, you know, how is it best to do it? Having one of them potentially on, you know, the agenda for our meeting so that we're kind of bringing that information in, because we didn't even bring all that into the task force as far as really getting into the pluses and minuses of caps. So it kind of falls into, you know, what additional data or analysis would we need? But again, that's why we needed to get a consensus here tonight, because if we wanted to, you know, if everybody said, no, we don't want to impose caps at this time, then we wouldn't bother trying to bring other resources in. But if we think that there's majority desire for it, then we will need to try to identify.
I don't think we even need to say we want to impose caps to spend time talking about caps. I mean, I think even, because I suspect there's some who don't want to impose caps, but I still think it would be helpful for all of us to be more informed, regardless of where we net out.
So, yeah. Mark, would you like to see additional time allocated toward?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll just make two comments if I may. One, and I've mentioned it to several people, I look at these as a little broader. I look at these as by and large, non-owner occupied dwellings. And there are additional concerns that we're not addressing, which is fine. When you have houses that are vacant for considerable periods of time, the implication upon the neighbors who are full-time residents. I characterize it as because we live surrounded by non-owner occupied dwellings, only of which one is a short-term rental. We de facto become the neighborhood watch, and I've mentioned that to several people. The other thing is, to your point that, oh my God, if we cap short-term rentals, Maros, you'll be able to walk in August and sit down at a table right away. I know, and this is anecdotally, but I know because where I live, the number of day trippers that come to this town is just monumental. Last summer, 2 summers ago, there was a line of traffic exiting onto exit 41 that went all the way to Holland, all the way to where 196 and 31 come together, waiting to get into town. Those were not people who were going to then go to a short-term rental. No, those were day trippers. So I believe that our businesses are doing just fine. And the whatever incremental cap that might be put on short-term rentals prospectively, I think will not have a monumental impact on our communities, retail and restaurant and commercial businesses. That's just, having lived here 10 years, that's my impression. And
So I see a consensus then that we want
Yes.
to have the discussion. So it will be, we'll just have to draw up how we're going to approach it and what we'll need for the January meeting. I'm welcome to input from any of you. I know you've already expressed that you would even like to see it potentially as a special meeting. For tonight, I would like to say just if people could let myself or Ryan know what your thoughts would be, that would be beneficial to be able to move this topic discussion further from what we currently have from the task force and from our public and community surveys.
Relative to short-term
Wherever
rentals.
the short-term rental, as well as if you get ideas of what you'd like to see, even in regards to parking, because we want both of those as items that we're going to be reviewing further, starting with the January meeting. The one thing I did when I was meeting with the mayor, and we were talking about the recommendations, and to Holly's point about some people on council, I said we would want to try to have it to where we should be able to, we can't give them an exact timeline maybe, but I'd like to shoot for expedience of, we would have a January meeting where we're looking at the items. By February, we want to be able to make decisions so that whether we're going to talk about implementing or not implementing, so that they could have a draft of a recommendation for us to review by March, so that we could make some kind of a commitment to council that if there was going to be recommendations regarding caps, they would have it by the end of March. So you have it in place before the next big season starts. And I think that's probably about the most aggressive that I thought we could possibly be on trying to give them an idea as to when they could expect something in the next round. And that may require a special meeting to get that done even by March.
I guess it kind of depends in my mind what else we would have on our January agenda. If we have several site plan reviews in January, which I know you probably can't tell now, but
Oh, I can, yeah.
if we have an open agenda, I don't see a reason for a special, but
Correct, I agree.
Yes,
So I
that's
think
all.
we, yeah, so I want to just kind of see what we can possibly get on the January agenda for maybe even have a special guest speaker, one or two. And what else we have. And then if we get into it and we have other things that come up on the agenda, then I think it will require a special between January and February's to try to hit. But at least I believe, and tell me if everyone is in agreement, that the end of, by March, to be able to have a yes or no of, if we're moving forward, the goal would be to have it to council by a recommendation by the end of our March meeting. Would that be reasonable with everybody that's here?
It feels like a long way away, but I'm,
And it's still completed within less than 1 year. It was March of last year. We were just trying to decide if we were going to have moratoriums.
So just to clarify, Mr. Chair, just so I understand from a staff perspective, you want to, certainly tonight you went through and indicate where there's consensus, where we maybe need a little bit more information on some of these recommendations, but I think there's consensus on a lot of items. Do you want us to hold off on starting to prepare those changes, or are we looking at two divergent paths? We're gonna,
One, everything that we talked about tonight that we all had consensus on, move forward as you got it right in here with drafting.
Yep.
The zoning and the changes for us to review those in January for recommending to council.
okay, so if we,
Caps would be in the second tranche of recommendation.
okay, so we'll move one group of items forward based on the discussion tonight, with you reviewing the language in January. Any zoning changes, say we're removing certificates from the zoning ordinance for short-term rentals and putting them in a police powers ordinance, there would be a concurrent zoning ordinance amendment that you would need to have a public hearing on at your February meeting. And so this first set of recommendations essentially could be going at the end of February, and then we will have a parallel path where you're separating out parking and
Potential
caps and potential residential caps is a separate path that you're going to further study with a timeline of hoping to have something for that sometime in March, it sounds like.
If we have to have public hearings, it may have to be April, but
Well, we can discuss these options next month, but if you're going to have caps in residential, we can probably do that through a police powers ordinance, so that wouldn't maybe necessarily require like a formal like public hearing, but
the public hearing ones, I envision that once we get through the other two topics, the parking and short term.
Mhm.
And then we would go back and address the zoning changes that are necessary for everything. And then couldn't that all be done all in one time? And then you have just one public hearing for the zoning changes?
yes, my concern with that path is that, and I discussed this with the council as well, and suggesting that they allow you to also look at the police power side of it. But worry about having a situation where we have a police powers ordinance requiring licensing every year, and we still have a zoning ordinance provision that requires a 3-year certificate, and if they don't kind of go concurrently,
Right.
I think we're gonna have conflicting regulations,
Okay.
so.
That's true. So we would be reviewing the ordinance and zoning changes in January for the ones that we are all had a consensus on tonight.
Correct.
Which would then require a public hearing.
On the zoning changes in February, yep.
Now, that public hearing could be a special meeting, correct?
Good.
Yeah, I think
We would need at
Get
least,
it done in a time.
well, the challenge is we have to have it, sorry, the commercial record 3 weeks in advance, so I mean, you're kind of, maybe you get an extra week out of it, but.
The public hearing would be February's meeting unless you did a special, which means that we recommend it to council this first tranche after after the February meeting. And we'll still be working on.
Now, if you want to set up separate special meetings to specifically focus on, parking and possible residential caps and just have those be your focus, or even just do one of those meetings, or we could do, maybe even instead of waiting for your regular meeting in January, we could set up an earlier special meeting in January and have that be the focus if that's a desire of yours as well. You do have one case next month to review, a special land use request for a restaurant with expanded outdoor dining and alcohol services at 650 Water Street. So
Is that the Riverview Market?
correct.
And they're more of like the things we talked about today. So the current short-term rental has a couple things that I'm like, I wonder what the intent of that was when those were written. It didn't come up with the task force and I was like, well, maybe, and we've had to deal with a couple of them. ADUs, why the special land use? It seems like that would, those would be a natural compliance officer. If it's at a place where somebody's living, why do we put that extra hoop? And then there's another item on there that says a single room rental is not allowed. Again, you have a natural compliance officer, and it goes to your conversation about businesses versus people living at the residence type place. So those are two current things that I don't know if we're open to looking at those at this time or where they should go in the conversation. Not as deep as caps or parking, but maybe just some simple discussion.
Yeah, I know those are from a staff perspective and maybe even a legal counsel perspective, those have been, those regulations have been a bit of a headache and challenging to work through. And I think, we have a desire to clean some things up. Just to clarify what we think your current regulations states, in its current form, whether you want to change those or not is another question, but I guess, we can bring, if you're all right with it, some of the, at least clarifying what we believe your current regulations are related to how short-term rentals relate to ADUs and the single contract provisions. If you want, we can include that with the recommended language. And then you can have, next month is simply further discussion on the language and setting a public hearing. It's not the actual public hearing. It's exactly what this process is to be.
So those are.
I think
ones
it
that I
would-
would like to include in that next, with the ones we sort of talked about today, it sort of fits that same field.
That's a very good comment because we might as well look at what we currently have that is either causing issues for
Yeah.
administration and legal. And if we're going to be adding things, we might as well clean up things also.
I think that's very wise. Yes.
You could be.
All right, there you go. Thank you.
No, those have been head scratchers for me.
Well, I appreciate everyone's time tonight, especially staff, because I know staff and councils.
Hey,
So,
we're all here together tonight.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes,
oh.
very-
You brought cookies, which was amazing. I ate mine. It was amazing. So.
I have an extra one here for you.
Next agenda.
Well, I think the next agenda has. If there's no additional conversation on that, we will close out the new business. I lost my agenda. Communication, I believe everyone got a copy of a letter that's in front of them in regards to the mural down the street. I guess he just asked for it to come to us and then Bobby give us all a postcard, which I think will say thank you and it's even addressed to each of us. So we appreciate that as far as, but other than that, I didn't have any additional communications. Do you have any, Ryan?
And our purview of response, I mean, what is it?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I don't think there's anything
No,
that's
it's not.
within ours, but he asked for us to be copied on, it, so it's, I don't know.
Yep. So it was correspondence we received that he sent to the planning commission as well. So passing it along for your information and it's not something that falls under a zoning matter. So.
And I don't know if any of the communication that we had, so then it's just the zoning activity report is included in the kit. I don't know if anybody had any questions for Ryan on that, but we can continue to find it very useful and I always thank him every month for it.
Good job, Ryan.
There's
Yeah.
nothing else on that.
Oh,
And we'll
did-
move to our last
like
public
the
comment.
slaughter.
During this public comment, you can comment on anything and it's limited to 3 minutes. If you're in the room, you'd come up to the microphone, say your name and address, and if you're online and would like to speak, just raise your hand. We have one here in the room.
It's everybody else is going to Florida or somewhere. Gary Kemp, 1022 Holland Street again.
Yes.
Appreciated the discussion. It sounds like you're trying to understand the issues and trying to resolve them in a fair and equitable way, which I appreciate. I have just one concern. When you're talking about beds and rooms, you might want to consider 2 one-bedroom condos, because that means if you only allow 2 people in a bedroom, you only have two that could stay in there. Secondly, more importantly, I'm really concerned about this cap issue that you're finally getting into, because the whole purpose, or not purpose, the results of the task force, which I volunteered to be on and didn't get to be, but was here for every meeting, ended up with no consensus on caps, and also ended up with the survey that was done that said, no, the bulk of people did not want caps. Okay, and when you considered outside owners of these properties that don't live in the town. So it was, obviously they're not residents, but they have a big stakehold here as owners of property and paying taxes at very high levels. So I am concerned that now this sounds like, well, let's come around to that and we'll sneak this thing in here in some fashion, because we know what everybody wants, even though that wasn't what came out of the results of the meetings and everything else. I would like to see you do this in stages, because I think if you do stage one being, get all these requirements about trash and parking and enforcement and codes and fees and all that, you got a lot of work to do. Trust me, you got a lot of work to do to get all the details worked out. And you're going to have another thing that concerns me, and that is that there's a lot of people who ain't around here right now. They're living in Florida, they're going to Florida, they're going wherever. And yes, you can communicate over the internet if you really stay on top of stuff. But I think you talk about public hearings, you're going to have trouble getting enough people here to the public hearing on some of the stuff. If you don't really do an excellent job of communication, I think it's going to be very hard to do that and try to cram all this into March. The other reason for March that concerns me is April's when all the people start coming and renting. And once we get into that, the people that are involved in this are going to be busier than heck. And I don't think it's going to be easy for them to stay on top of this and involved in this, and also start their own businesses and get all that under control. So that's my advice to you, and hopefully it'll all come out and we'll all be happy.
Thank you, Gary. I got Ethan online.
Hello, thanks. Yeah, Ethan Barty, 584 Lake Street, owns several properties in Saugatuck. Just comment, hoping that everybody's not so short-sighted in their thinking in the last 3 years. I mean, the COVID boom's over. I would like you to do some research on what's happening in the vacation rental industry. It's on a big downturn. I said from the very beginning, I think it's going to correct itself. A lot of these people bought at the high market. There's going to be people coming in and buying and living here again. These places aren't going to be able to cash flow at what they bought them. I mean, as far as insurances and, things you guys were talking about, look at the past 100 years. How many issues have we had over the last, 100 years that we've been renting here? How's it been a problem? Also look at the local news. St. Joe, they're jealous of us. They're looking at implementing, they want vacation rentals. Their businesses are suffering. So please, the day trippers, not working for them. It just came out in the news. Look it up, please. As far as rules, regulations, there's a lot of owners that don't rent. They come in the summertime. They have people that come. There's parking issues there. There's trash issues. Why do we have to look at it as issues for just renters and not owners? I mean, if it's an issue for the whole town. So why do we have to discriminate? Why can't we just have rules for trash, rules for parking, implement them so that we're all happy? We're discriminating in between the two when a lot of times it's the owners that have a big group and family members come in and their trash is overflowing. They're parking in the streets. So, you can't just say it's all vacation rentals. We need rules, we need regulation, we need enforcement for the town, for everyone. so that we all can live in harmony. So I guess I don't want us to be short-sighted in that the last 4 years, 5 years is an anomaly in a lot of areas. And the vacation rental industry has a big correction coming. And part of that correction is going to be, they're going to go away from vacation rentals and people are going to come back into our communities and it's going to be natural attrition. So please look forward and look backward and make decisions based on that and not just the last 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks.
Anyone else I don't see online that would close public comments? Last item would be any comments by commissioners before we would close.
I just want to address one thing to Mr. Kemp. So on the survey, when you look at people who lived in the residential neighborhoods, actually there was support for caps. So you have to scroll down a click or two in the data. So happy to talk to you offline about that if you'd like.
Anything else? No, and I would try to assure anyone who is still listening or will listen to this online after the 2 hours and 45 minutes. But as a planning commission, I can say for the chair and everyone that I've spoken with and is sitting here today, as well as Ann, we are all committed to making certain that we try to look at this in a way, especially on the caps and any parking, of the impact and understanding, the rationale behind it. And that's why it will require additional time, but no one is making decisions, just based upon what we're at right now, because it was inconclusive. And so we have been asked if we wanted to continue that discussion, and I think it has been, the majority has said they'd like to continue it. And that's all it is a continuation to kind of look to see is there additional data that we may be able to learn. So with that, I will ask if anyone wants to call for adjournment.
So move.
Support.
All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Merry
Thank you. Merry Christmas to everyone.
Christmas.
Happy holidays.
And
Yep.
to, and